I first saw the cabin late in the afternoon, sitting at the bottom of a small valley, its roof barely visible through the thick trees. I had been hiking alone for most of the day, following an old logging road that had long since been overtaken by weeds and fallen branches. It wasn't the first time I had wandered off the main trails, but something about this place felt different. The air was heavy, the woods unnaturally quiet. I was about 15 miles from my truck, deep in the backcountry where few people ventured. The area had a reputation. Stories about missing hunters, strange noises at night, things people dismissed as superstition. I never put much stock in that kind of talk, but standing there, staring at that rundown structure half hidden in the trees, I felt uneasy. The place looked abandoned. The walls were warped with age, and the roof sagged in the middle. The single window was clouded with grime. A rusty chimney jutted out of one side, and an old wooden door hung slightly ajar. There were no paths leading to it, no signs that anyone had been there in years. I should have kept walking, but the sun was already dipping low, and I was exhausted. The idea of spending the night in an old cabin, away from the wind and the cold, was too tempting. So I made my way down the slope, pushing through undergrowth and loose rocks, boots crunching against the damp earth. Up close, the cabin was worse than I had thought. The wood was cracked and splintered, the door barely hanging on its hinges. The whole structure had a smell, old, musty, with a faint trace of something rotten beneath it. But inside it was dry, and that was good enough for me. I set my pack down and looked around. The room was small, just a single space with a rickety wooden table and a chair. Against the far wall was a stone fireplace, its opening dark with soot. In the corner, a simple wooden bed frame with a bare mattress, the fabric torn and yellowed. Dust coated everything. There were no personal belongings, no signs that anyone had lived there recently. Just an old hunting knife stuck into the table and a half-empty canteen lying on the floor. I didn't like it, but I had stayed in worse places. I decided I'd build a fire, get some food in me, and try to get some sleep. As I gathered wood from outside, I kept glancing back at the cabin, that feeling of unease never quite leaving. Something about the place felt off, like it had been abandoned in a hurry, like someone had left and never planned on coming back. That night, I barely slept. The wind howled through the trees, making the walls creak and groan. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the room. I lay on top of my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, listening. I had spent enough time in the wilderness to know when something wasn't right. The woods weren't supposed to be this quiet. No owls, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just silence. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it. A soft creak. The sound of a floorboard shifting under weight. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. My knife was in my pack, out of reach. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers. Slowly, I turned my head toward the door. It was still shut. Then another sound, a faint scrape, like something being dragged across wood, came from just outside. I forced myself to sit up, heart hammering in my chest. My rifle was next to me, but I hesitated. If it was an animal, a coyote or a bear, I didn't want to fire and waste ammo. But if it wasn't, the door shuddered. Not a knock, not the wind. Something was testing it. I grabbed the rifle and pointed it at the entrance. My finger hovered over the trigger. The door creaked again, just slightly. The silence stretched on. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving away. I waited, straining to hear, but the sounds faded into the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there, rifle in hand, watching the door until the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the walls. When morning came, I stepped outside, every muscle in my body tense. The ground was damp from the night's dew. I looked around. There were no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there, but I knew what I had heard. I packed up quickly, throwing my gear together with shaking hands. I didn't want to be there any longer than I had to. As I started up the slope, I took one last look at the cabin. The door was open wider than before. I was sure I had closed it. I hiked fast, my back prickling the entire way. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I threw my pack into the passenger seat, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, just breathing. I never went back to that part of the woods, and I never told anyone what happened, because whatever was out there that night, it wasn't looking for shelter. I arrived at the cabin just after noon, my truck kicking up dust on the long, unpaved road leading to the property. The place looked older than I expected, more worn down than the photos had shown. The wooden siding was gray and splintered in places, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. The porch railing was broken on one side, and the steps creaked under my weight as I walked up to the door. There was a musty, damp smell inside, like wood that had been left to rot. The floorboards groaned under my boots, and cobwebs hung thick in the corners. The cabin was small, just a single room with a loft, a tiny kitchen, and a wood stove in the center. The furniture was mismatched and old, the kind you'd find in a secondhand store. There was no running water, just a well outside with a hand pump, and the bathroom was an outhouse a short walk into the trees. It was exactly the kind of isolation I had been looking for. I spent the first few hours settling in, unpacking my gear and checking the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, the trees tall and thick with underbrush. There was a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods, likely an old hunting path. I found a rusted metal drum a few yards from the back of the cabin, filled with what looked like burned trash and broken glass. Nearby, a small pile of bones, probably animal remains, sat partially buried in the dirt. The first night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The wind pushed through the trees, making them groan and creak, and every so often, I heard something rustling in the underbrush. I kept my rifle close just in case. On the second day, I explored deeper into the woods. I followed the old trail for nearly an hour before coming across something strange. A collapsed shack, long abandoned. The roof had caved in, and the walls were leaning inward, barely standing. Inside, the remnants of a bed frame and a rusted-out stove sat half-buried under debris. What caught my attention, though, was the smell. Even after years of being exposed to the elements, there was still a faint odor of decay. Animal bones littered the floor, and scratches covered the wooden walls, deep gouges that ran in erratic patterns. I felt uneasy standing there, like I had stepped somewhere I shouldn't have. I left quickly, following my own footprints back to the cabin. As I walked, I noticed something odd. There were no sounds in the woods, no birds, no insects, just silence. It was only when I reached the clearing around the cabin that I heard the forest come back to life, the distant call of a crow breaking the quiet. That night, something woke me up. A sound, something moving just outside the cabin. It was slow, deliberate. I reached for my rifle and listened, my heart pounding. Then, a scraping noise, like something dragging along the porch railing. I stayed still, waiting. The sound moved toward the door, then stopped. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Then a single, deliberate knock. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just gripped the rifle and stared at the door. After a long moment, I heard footsteps retreating, moving around the side of the cabin, then disappearing into the woods. The next morning, I found deep, uneven footprints in the dirt outside, too large for an animal, too erratic for a human. They led from the trees to the porch and then back into the forest. Near the steps, I found something else. A small pile of rocks stacked neatly, like a marker. I wanted to leave, but the nearest town was hours away, and my truck's gas tank was running low. I decided to stay one more night, planning to leave at first light. That night, I barricaded the door and kept my rifle close. I sat in the chair facing the door, waiting. The woods were silent again, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. The same slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. They stopped outside the door. Then, a scratching sound, slow, deliberate, like nails against the wood. My breathing was shallow, my grip on the rifle tight. Then the knock, just once. A single, deliberate knock. I didn't answer. The scratching continued for a moment longer. then stopped. The footsteps moved away, back toward the woods. I barely slept. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I packed my things and loaded up my truck. Before leaving, I looked back at the cabin. Something was different. Near the edge of the trees, another pile of rocks had appeared, stacked neatly, just like the one by the porch. I didn't stay to figure out why. I got in my truck and drove, watching the woods in my rearview mirror until the cabin was out of sight. I never went back. I was never one to be scared of the woods. I grew up around them, spent my childhood exploring thick forests, climbing trees, and sleeping under the stars. The idea of solitude never bothered me. If anything, I craved it. So when I got the chance to stay at an old cabin deep in the wilderness for a week, I jumped at it. The cabin belonged to a distant cousin of mine, a guy I barely knew. He had bought the place years ago but rarely used it anymore. He told me it was quiet, off-grid, and surrounded by miles of untouched land. No cell service, no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, an old well, and a lantern. It sounded perfect. I packed light, a sleeping bag, food, a hunting knife, and a rifle, more for comfort than necessity. The drive out took nearly 5 hours, the last stretch on a dirt road barely wide enough for my truck. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, and the forest had that golden glow that only comes before sunset. The cabin was small, weathered, and smelled like damp wood. The front door creaked on rusted hinges. Inside, there was a single cot, a wooden table, a chair, and a cast iron stove. The walls were lined with old tools, dusty books, and a few shelves stocked with canned goods. A narrow staircase led up to a small loft, barely big enough for a mattress. It was exactly what I expected. I spent the first night in complete silence. No cars, no distant hum of civilization. Just the wind shifting through the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I slept fine, woke up with the sun, and spent the next day exploring. The woods were dense, a mix of pine and birch, with thick undergrowth in some areas and wide, open clearings in others. I found a small creek about a mile away, the water cold and clear. Everything felt normal. It wasn't until the second night that I noticed something strange. I woke up around midnight, needing to take a piss. Stepping outside, the air was crisp, and the sky was clear, stars stretching forever. As I stood there, I got this feeling, this odd sense that I wasn't alone. I looked around, scanning the treeline. Nothing, just trees and shadows. But the feeling stuck with me. The next morning, I went about my routine, chopping wood, boiling water, hiking out a bit, but that uneasy feeling hadn't left. As I walked, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Broken branches in odd places, patches of disturbed earth, a tree with deep scratches running down the bark. Claw marks? Maybe, maybe not. By the fourth day, I knew something wasn't right. I had set out early that morning, planning to track deeper into the woods. A few hours in, I stumbled onto something that made my stomach drop. It was an old hunting blind, nothing unusual in itself except it was torn apart. The wooden walls were splintered, the roof half collapsed. Inside, there was a pile of bones, not fresh but not ancient either, picked clean, scattered. I felt a deep unease settle in my chest. Could have been an old kill site for a predator, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But something about it felt wrong. The way the blind had been destroyed, deliberate, violent. I turned back, moving faster than I liked to admit. The whole way, I kept checking over my shoulder. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just my footsteps and the wind. That night, I locked the cabin door. It wouldn't do much good, it was old wood, easy to break. But it made me feel better. I kept the rifle close. Every few hours, I'd wake up, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. A snap like a branch breaking. Close, too close. I held my breath. Then, another sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Circling the cabin. I stayed frozen. Whatever it was, it didn't try the door. It didn't knock, didn't scratch. Just walked. I could hear it moving in the dirt, the faint crunch of leaves. Then silence. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt outside. Not boot prints, not paws, something in between. Long, narrow, with deep impressions at the front, like claws. My stomach turned. I followed them a few yards before they disappeared into the brush. I was done. I packed up fast, threw everything into my truck, and got the hell out. The whole drive back, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the woods, watching. I never told my cousin, never asked if he had seen anything strange out there. I didn't want to know, and I never went back. I had been searching for a quiet place to get away for a while. I wasn't looking for a vacation or a scenic retreat, just somewhere isolated where I could be alone. No neighbors, no noise, just the woods and me. I found a place through an old buddy who had done some land surveying up north. He told me about a cabin deep in the forest, a place that had been abandoned for years but still stood solid. It was about 20 miles from the nearest town, and there wasn't a paved road leading to it, just an overgrown dirt path. He gave me rough directions and told me it was mine if I wanted it. The idea of having an entire cabin to myself in the middle of nowhere sounded exactly like what I needed. So, I packed up my truck with supplies, enough food, water, and gear to last me a couple of weeks. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The main road turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to something barely resembling a path at all. Trees pressed in on both sides, and I had to slow to a crawl to avoid potholes and branches. After an hour of careful maneuvering, I reached a clearing. The cabin was exactly as my friend had described. Small, sturdy, and forgotten by time. It had a single door, 2 shuttered windows, and a chimney sticking out of a moss-covered roof. The wood was dark with age, and vines curled up the walls. It wasn't inviting, but I wasn't looking for comfort. I parked and took my first steps toward the cabin. The air smelled damp, like wet earth and decaying leaves. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustling in the undergrowth. I unlocked the door with a key my friend had given me, an old brass thing that stuck in the lock before turning with a loud clunk. Inside, it was what I expected, bare bones. A cot against one wall, a small cast iron stove, and a wooden table with a single chair. The air was stale, but nothing smelled rotten. Dust covered everything, but the place was solid. The windows had thick wooden shutters, which I decided to keep closed. The last thing I wanted was some stray animal watching me sleep. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time hiking, chopping firewood, and sitting by the stove at night, listening to the crackling flames. There was something satisfying about being so disconnected. No phone service, no distractions, just the woods. But by the 4th night, something started to feel off. It was small at first, little things, the feeling that the air had shifted when I woke up. My axe, which I was sure I had left by the door, was leaning against a tree outside. My backpack, zipped up the night before, was open when I woke up. I convinced myself I was being forgetful. That's what isolation does to you. Your mind plays tricks, makes you question yourself. But then it got worse. I started noticing footprints. Not mine. They were faint, scattered through the clearing, but they were there. I checked my own boots, compared them. These prints were smaller, bare feet pressed into the soft dirt. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but deep down I knew better. The next night, I made sure everything was exactly where I left it. I locked the door. I latched the windows. I put my boots by the bed. I woke up to the door slightly open, just an inch. I stared at it for a long time before getting up, heart hammering. I stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. Nothing. The trees stood motionless. The ground was undisturbed, but the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, like something was just out of sight, watching. I stayed up that night, sitting by the door with my hatchet in my lap. Every sound outside felt amplified. Every shift in the wind made my skin crawl. I told myself I was being paranoid, that isolation was getting to me, that I was hearing things that weren't there. Then, the next night, I heard it. A soft shuffle outside the cabin. A faint crunch of leaves. A deliberate sound. Slow, careful. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then the sound stopped. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Then, just as I was about to let out a breath, something brushed against the wall outside. A slow, dragging sound, like fingertips across wood. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into my backpack. As I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints, dozens of them, bare feet circling the cabin. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my gear, threw it into the truck, and sped down that overgrown trail without looking back. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. I never went back, and I never will. I had been planning the trip for months. Just a week alone in the woods, away from everything. No people, no work, no noise. Just me, a small off-grid cabin I found on an old forestry map, and the quiet of the mountains. It wasn't on any rental site. I didn't even know if it was still standing. It was something I found by piecing together old maps, researching logging routes, and comparing satellite images. From what I could tell, the cabin had been abandoned for decades, sitting in a small clearing miles from any maintained road. It was exactly what I wanted. Isolation. The drive took most of the day. The roads got worse the deeper I went. Pavement turned to gravel, gravel turned to rutted dirt, and then even that disappeared. I parked where the road ended and hiked the rest of the way. My pack was heavy, but I had brought enough food, water, and supplies to last the week. No need to rely on whatever condition the cabin was in. I wasn't expecting much. A leaky roof, maybe some old furniture. As long as it had 4 walls, I'd be fine. When I finally saw it, I almost laughed. It was still standing, but just barely. The roof sagged in the middle, the wooden walls were grayed with age, and the single window had long since lost its glass. The door was missing, leaning against the frame at an angle. I stepped inside. Dust covered everything. The floor was solid enough, though a few boards creaked under my weight. A rusted metal bed frame sat in one corner, the mattress nothing more than a pile of decayed stuffing. Against the far wall was a wood-burning stove, rusted but intact. There was even a small table with a single chair, both covered in dust and rodent droppings. It wasn't much, but it would do. I set up my gear, sweeping out the worst of the debris and unrolling my sleeping bag on the wooden floor. There were signs of past visitors. Old beer cans, a broken lantern, the remnants of a fire pit just outside, but nothing recent. No footprints, no fresh trash. It seemed like no one had been here in years. The first day was uneventful. I explored the area, set up a small fire, cooked, and enjoyed the quiet. The forest was dense, the trees thick and close together. No trails, no sign of people, just deep woods stretching in every direction. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. At night, the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of small animals. The second day, I found something odd. A few hundred yards from the cabin, deeper into the woods, I stumbled across an old fence. The posts were rotting, the wire rusted and sagging. It ran in a rough rectangle, enclosing nothing but trees and undergrowth. No buildings, no ruins, just a fence, long forgotten. Why would someone build a fence out here, in the middle of nowhere? There were no old farmsteads marked on my maps, no history of settlements. It made no sense. I followed it for a while, but it eventually disappeared into thick brush, swallowed by the forest. That night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned down to embers, the cabin silent. Then I heard it, something moving outside, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another step, then silence. Could have been anything. A deer, a bear, even a raccoon. But something about it felt wrong. It wasn't the random rustling of an animal foraging. It was steady, purposeful. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The weak beam barely cut through the darkness beyond the cabin walls. I swept it across the trees, looking for movement. Nothing, but I felt it. That sensation of being watched, of something just beyond my sight. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. But in the morning, I found footprints. Human footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping just short of the doorway. They weren't mine. I searched the area, but whoever had been there was gone. No trail, no sign of where they came from or where they went. Just those prints in the dirt, as if someone had stood there for hours, watching. The third night was worse. I barricaded the doorway with my pack, keeping my hatchet close. I barely slept, every noise making my pulse jump. Sometime in the early hours, I heard it again, movement just outside. This time, it didn't stop at the tree line. Came closer, slow, careful steps on the porch. The sound of something shifting against the wood. Then silence. I gripped the hatchet and waited, heart pounding. The fire was low, the light barely enough to see. I didn't dare move. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. When dawn came, I stepped outside. The ground was disturbed, but the footprints were gone, as if someone had brushed them away. I packed my things. The plan had been a full week, but I wasn't staying another night. As I shouldered my pack, I took one last look at the fence, barely visible through the trees. That was when I saw it, something I had missed before, a gap where the fence had collapsed. Just beyond it, half hidden in the undergrowth, was an old, rotting doorframe. Not part of a cabin. Something else. Something underground. I didn't want to know. Whatever was out there, whatever had been watching me, I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I hiked back to my truck, moving fast, every rustling branch making my skin crawl. The whole way I felt it, that unseen presence just out of sight, watching. I didn't look back. I never went back. I was looking for a place to get away, a real escape, somewhere off-grid, where I wouldn't hear traffic or see another person for days. I wanted to spend a week in deep solitude, hiking, fishing, and just being alone. I had been dealing with too much work, family stress, the kind of things that build up until you feel like you're drowning. So I went looking for a cabin. Not a rental, not some cozy bed and breakfast type thing. I wanted something truly abandoned, something deep in the woods. After searching online and digging through maps, I found a reference to an old hunting cabin, built decades ago but long forgotten. It wasn't on any official trails, just a mention in an old forum post about places hunters used to stay in the 70s. The directions were vague, just a few landmarks and an old dirt road that was probably more of a trail now. But that's exactly what I was looking for. Took me most of a day to drive out there. The last stretch of road was barely a road at all, just overgrown dirt and deep ruts from the last time someone had driven through. My truck barely made it, tires spinning in mud, branches scraping the sides. But then I saw it just beyond a clearing. A small, square cabin, the wood dark with age, the roof sagging slightly. No windows, just a single door. The place looked abandoned, exactly like I'd hoped. The front porch was partially collapsed, and the door was slightly ajar, shifting in the wind. I stepped inside, breathing in the smell of damp wood and old dust. Inside was simple, one large room, a rusted-out wood stove in the corner, a few broken chairs, and a small table. There were shelves along one wall, mostly empty except for some old canned goods that had rusted over. Someone had left a cot in the corner, the mattress torn and yellowed with age. It was perfect. I set my bag down, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and started setting up. I had plenty of supplies, food, water, a camp stove, and enough firewood to last the week. As I moved through the cabin, something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Just a feeling, like the air was too still. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I shook it off and went outside to gather more firewood before dark. The forest was dense, the trees packed tightly together, the undergrowth thick. As I walked, I noticed something strange, tree stumps, but not from recent logging. These were old, the cuts weathered and splintered. The odd part was that they were arranged in a rough circle, all cut at the same height, like seats around an invisible fire. I told myself it was nothing, just an odd coincidence, but it made me uneasy. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. The wind barely moved through the trees. There were no sounds, no birds, no insects, nothing. It was too quiet. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black, but something had woken me. A sound? I held my breath, listening. There it was again, a faint creaking, like wood shifting under weight. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer stepping onto the porch. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate sound, like footsteps on old wood. I sat up, heart pounding. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't want to turn it on yet. I just listened. The creaking stopped. The silence stretched out, pressing down on me. Then the door shifted, just slightly. Not enough to open, just a soft nudge, like someone was testing it. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. Then nothing. No more sounds. No movement. Just silence. I stayed awake for hours, knife in hand, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off again. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The door was still closed. There were no footprints outside. Nothing disturbed. It made me question if I had really heard anything at all. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe the old wood was settling. I forced myself to shake it off, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I spent the day hiking, trying to distract myself. The forest was dense, harder to navigate than I expected. I found a small creek, filled my canteen, and sat by the water for a while. But even out there, I felt watched, like the trees had eyes. On my way back, I took a different route, trying to get my bearings. That's when I found something I couldn't explain. A boot, old, half buried in the dirt. The leather cracked and dry. It wasn't mine. It wasn't from any recent camper. This thing had been out here for years. Nearby, I found something worse. A rope, tied around a tree, frayed and rotting, but still knotted tight. I turned and headed back to the cabin, walking faster now. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. The door shifted just a fraction of an inch. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the door. There was no one there. The footsteps stopped. But then, just outside the edge of the light, I saw it. A single footprint in the dirt. Fresh. I wasn't alone out here. I packed up immediately. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I threw everything into my bag, grabbed my gear, and stepped outside, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. I moved fast, not running, but close. My truck was parked a few hundred yards away, and every step felt like something was right behind me. I didn't look back. When I reached my truck, I tossed my gear in, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I turned onto the overgrown dirt road, my headlights swept across the trees. And for just a second, I saw him, a man, standing just beyond the tree line, motionless, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I drove until I hit pavement, then kept going until I reached the next town. I checked into the first motel I found, locked the door, and sat awake until the sun came up. The next day, I looked up the cabin again, tried to find more information, but it was gone. The old forum post had been deleted, like it had never existed. I never meant to stay at the cabin. It was just supposed to be a place to stop for a night, a way to break up the long drive. I had been heading north, away from the city, trying to put some distance between myself and the noise, the crowds, the pressure. The idea was to find some peace, maybe camp for a few days and reset my head. I wasn't in a hurry, so when I spotted the dirt road cutting off from the highway, I figured I'd take it. It was mid-afternoon, the sky was overcast, and the dense pine forest on either side of the road made it feel like the world had shrunk. It seemed like a good enough place to rest. The The road was rougher than I expected, filled with potholes and soft spots from recent rain. The further I went, the narrower it became, and after about 4 miles, I came across the cabin. It sat at the edge of a clearing, old and weathered, like it had been there forever. The windows were dark, the roof sagged slightly, and the porch steps looked half-rotted. But it wasn't falling apart completely. It was still standing. It looked abandoned. I cut the engine and sat there for a while, just listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no birds, just the heavy, suffocating silence that made everything feel wrong. I told myself it was fine, just a rundown hunting cabin, probably unused for years. No different from any of the other empty places scattered through the woods. I wasn't planning on staying inside anyway. I just needed a place to park for the night. I got out, stretched my legs, and took a better look. The door was shut, but not locked. There were no signs of recent activity, no tire tracks, no footprints, nothing to suggest that anyone had been here in a long time. But something about it made me uneasy. The windows were covered in grime, but I could still make out faint streaks, like someone had wiped them down just enough to see inside. The thought made my stomach turn. I checked the area around the cabin. There was an old fire pit, long cold, with a few rusted cans scattered nearby. A makeshift clothesline hung between 2 trees, the rope frayed and sagging. Behind the cabin, a narrow trail disappeared into the trees, leading further into the woods. I didn't like it. The whole place had a feeling to it, like it was waiting. I told myself I was being stupid, that I was just letting my imagination get to me. But I still didn't go inside. Instead, I set up my tent a good 20 yards from the cabin, closer to the tree line. I didn't want to be near it. I got a small fire going, cooked a quick meal, and settled in for the night. The silence pressed down on me. The fire crackled, but it didn't feel like enough. I kept glancing at the cabin, half expecting to see movement in the windows, even though I knew no one was there, or at least I hoped no one was. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, staring up at the dark canvas of my tent, listening to every rustle and crack in the underbrush. The woods felt wrong, like they weren't really empty. Every time I started to drift off, some small noise would snap me awake again. I checked my watch, almost 3 a.m. Then I heard it, a creak, slow and deliberate like weight shifting on old wood, came from the porch. My blood went cold. I held my breath, listening. Another creak, then another. Someone was moving out there. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving only faint, flickering light. I couldn't see the cabin from where I was. I didn't want to move. Then, a sound that made my skin crawl, wooden boards flexing, the groan of the door shifting on its hinges. Not opening, just moving, like someone had pressed against it, testing it. I reached for my flashlight, but stopped myself. If I turned it on, I'd be seen. I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself with if someone was really out there. My truck was too far to reach without exposing myself. I was stuck. For what felt like hours, I lay there listening, waiting, but the sound never came again. No footsteps, no retreating movements, just silence. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself to move. I unzipped the tent slowly, carefully, scanning the area. The cabin door was closed. The porch looked the same as before. Nothing seemed out of place, but I knew what I had heard. I packed up fast. I didn't even bother eating, just grabbed my gear and got to the truck. As I threw my last bag in the back, I glanced at the cabin one last time. The door was open, just a crack, enough to see inside. I didn't look. I didn't want to know. I got in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I don't know who or what was in that cabin. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the wind shifting the old boards, the settling of a structure long left to rot. But I know what I heard, and I know I'll never go back. I had been looking for an isolated place to spend a few weeks, somewhere far from work, people, and the steady hum of traffic that never seemed to die down in the city. I found the cabin on a website that specialized in remote rentals. No frills, no amenities beyond the bare essentials. The listing made it clear that there was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and no landline. That was fine by me. I wanted to be alone. The drive took most of the day. The last hour was on a rough dirt road that twisted through thick forest, the kind of road that made you question whether you'd missed a turn somewhere. The trees grew so thick on either side that in some stretches, it felt like driving through a tunnel. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was exactly what I had been hoping for. Small, sturdy looking, built from dark logs, and set deep in the woods where no one would bother me. There was a well out front, an old metal pump that still worked, and a small woodshed stocked with just enough firewood to last a few days. Inside, the place was simple. A single-room layout with a cot pushed against the wall, a wood stove, a small table, and a few shelves stocked with canned food. A lantern and a stack of matches sat on the table. I unloaded my gear, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, and got a fire going before the sun started to dip behind the trees. That first night, I sat outside on the small porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. An owl calling in the distance, the rustling of leaves as some small animal moved through the underbrush. It was peaceful. The second night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was subtle at first, like something shifting in the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was probably just the wind or a deer moving through the woods, but something about it felt different. The sound didn't move off, stayed in one place just beyond my sight. I lay there listening. After a while, it stopped. I told myself I was just being paranoid and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I checked around the cabin, but there were no tracks, nothing to suggest anything had been there at all. I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I had been half asleep, caught between a dream and reality. But that night, the sound came back. This time, it was closer. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, slow, careful movement. Something circling the cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just listened. At some point, it stopped again. I stayed awake for hours, straining to hear anything else, but the woods were silent. When the first light of dawn crept through the gaps in the logs, I finally pulled myself out of bed and went outside. This time, there were tracks. Footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I tried to stay calm. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost, stumbled onto the cabin, and then moved on. But why wouldn't they knock? Why would they just circle the cabin in the middle of the night and then disappear? I walked the perimeter, following the prints. They led into the woods, vanishing into the undergrowth. I thought about following them, but the thought of stepping into those trees, chasing after someone who had been lurking outside my cabin at night, made my skin crawl. Instead, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept my axe nearby. I started keeping the fire going at night, figuring the light might deter whoever was out there. The next few nights were quiet. I started to think maybe it had been a one-time thing. Maybe whoever it was had moved on. Then, one morning, I woke up to find the cabin door slightly open. I knew I had locked it. I checked the latch before bed every night. My hands went cold as I pushed it fully open and stepped outside. More footprints, but this time they led up to the door, and they didn't walk away. Whoever it was had come inside. I checked my gear, but nothing was missing. My food was still on the shelf. My axe was still by the bed, but the air in the cabin felt different. Felt like someone had been there. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things, threw everything into the truck, and left that morning. I didn't look back. As I drove down that narrow dirt road, winding through the trees, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over and sat there for a long time, just breathing. I never found out who it was, never found out what they wanted, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone out there. I wasn't looking for trouble. I just wanted a quiet place to hunt for a weekend. away from people, away from noise. That's why I rented a remote hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. The owner, some guy named Bill, had listed it online with just a few pictures, an old one-room log structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a small table. It was cheap, and that's all I cared about. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, my truck bumping along the narrow dirt road that cut through thick pine and spruce. It was late October, cold but not quite freezing, the kind of weather that made the forest quiet. No insects, few birds, just the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. The cabin was more run down than the pictures had shown. The roof sagged slightly, and the wood was dark with age. The porch had a single chair and a pile of firewood stacked haphazardly against the wall. The door had a heavy iron latch instead of a lock, which struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Inside, it was exactly what I expected, bare bones. A cot against one wall, a rusty wood stove in the center, and a table with a couple of mismatched chairs. A shelf held a few dusty cans of food, and there was an old metal sink with a pump handle. No electricity, no plumbing, just as advertised. I set down my gear, checked for any signs of rodents, and started a fire in the stove to warm the place up. It smelled like damp wood and old ashes. I spent the first evening scouting the area, marking trails, and setting up a tree stand a few hundred yards from the cabin. The forest was dense, mostly evergreens, with occasional clearings filled with dead leaves. I didn't see much sign of deer, but it was still early. As the sun dropped, I headed back to the cabin, cooked a can of chili on my propane burner, and settled in for the night. The first odd thing happened around midnight. I woke up to a sound outside. Not an animal, something heavier, slower. Footsteps on the porch. My rifle was next to me, and I grabbed it as I sat up, listening. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light. I waited, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. I didn't hear anything else for a long time. After a while, I convinced myself it had been the wind shifting the porch boards or maybe a raccoon. I lay back down, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I checked the ground outside. No tracks, no sign of anything. Maybe I had imagined it. I spent the day hunting, but it was uneventful. No deer, no movement in the woods. The silence was unsettling. I had hunted alone before, but something about this place felt different. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. That night, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They moved around the cabin. I gripped my rifle, listening as the sound circled the cabin once, then twice, then silence. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt. Not animal tracks, boots. Someone had walked around the cabin in the night. I was 30 miles from the nearest town with no cell service, and I hadn't seen another person since I left the main road. My first thought was that maybe Bill, the owner, had come by to check on the place. But why would he walk around in the middle of the night without saying anything? I spent the day hunting again, but I was distracted. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves put me on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, watching. But the woods were empty. That evening, I made sure my rifle was loaded before going to bed. I barred the door with a heavy chair and kept my flashlight close. If I heard the footsteps again, I wasn't going to sit in the dark and wait. The footsteps came, like clockwork, just past midnight. Slow, deliberate. I gripped my rifle and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the window. The beam hit the glass and reflected back at me. The footsteps stopped. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The light from my flashlight caught something just beyond the window. A shape, barely visible through the glare. A face. Someone was standing there, watching me. I raised my rifle, heart pounding, but before I could move, the figure was gone. No sound, no footsteps retreating, just gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my gear. I had planned to stay until Sunday, but I wasn't spending another night there. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp and cold, my breath visible in the morning light. The forest was quiet, still, too still. I walked around the cabin, checking the ground. The The boot prints were there, same as before, but now there were more. The tracks led from the woods, circled the cabin, and then disappeared back into the trees. I didn't waste any more time. I loaded my gear into the truck and got the hell out of there. When I finally had cell service, I called Bill. No answer. I left a message, asking if he had been out at the cabin, but he never called back. A week later, I checked the listing online. The cabin was gone. No record of it, no contact info for Bill. Like it had never existed. I don't know who was out there with me that weekend, and I don't want to know. But I won't ever rent a remote cabin alone again. It was late October when I took the trip. The days were getting shorter, the nights colder, and most people had packed up their summer homes for the season. That was exactly why I chose this time to go. I wanted the solitude. I had spent years hiking and camping in remote places, but this was my first time renting a cabin alone in the middle of nowhere. I found it listed online, advertised as an off-grid experience deep in the mountains of western Montana. No running water, no electricity, no cell service. Just a wood stove, a creek for water, and miles of dense forest in every direction. It sounded perfect. The drive took most of the day. The last hour was spent on a narrow dirt road barely wide enough for my truck. It twisted up the side of a steep ridge, and with no guardrails, a single mistake would mean tumbling hundreds of feet down into the pines. My tires slipped on loose gravel more than once, forcing me to grip the wheel with white-knuckled focus. When I finally reached the cabin, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was a simple log structure, weathered and darkened by years of exposure. A slanted tin roof, a stone chimney, a front porch with a single rocking chair. No neighbors, no signs of life, just towering trees and the sound of the wind. I stepped out of my truck and stretched, listening to the silence. It felt different than being in the woods on a normal camping trip. More isolated, heavier. I unlocked the door with the key I had been given and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and old wood, like it hadn't been lived in for years. A cast iron stove stood in the corner beside a pile of chopped logs, ready to burn. The furniture was basic, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a single bed pushed against the back wall. A small shelf held a few rusted pots and pans, along with a stack of yellowed paperbacks. I found a lantern and lit it, watching the dim glow push back the deepening shadows. Before the sun set, I made sure to gather firewood. The nights would be cold, and I didn't want to wake up freezing. I hiked a short distance into the woods, finding plenty of dry branches and splitting them with the old axe I found propped against the cabin. As I worked, I felt a strange unease settle over me. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like the nagging sense that I was being watched. I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place and shook it off. By the time darkness fully set in, I had a fire going inside. The warmth was comforting, and I felt more at ease. I ate a simple meal from the supplies I had packed and read for a while by lantern light. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind rattling the tin roof. It was peaceful, at least at first. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was almost completely dark. I wasn't sure what had woken me at first. Then I heard it, a sound just outside. Soft, deliberate steps on the porch. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The steps stopped. The rocking chair creaked slightly, as if someone had brushed against it. I reached for the lantern, my fingers fumbling in the dark. I lit it quickly, the small flame barely illuminating the room. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something about the sound had been different, more deliberate, more human. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening. Nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch, half expecting to see footprints in the dirt, but there was nothing. The ground was too hard. The wind had likely erased any traces. I told myself I had imagined it, that my mind had been playing tricks on me in the isolation. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, hiking up a nearby ridge to get a better view of the valley below. It was stunning, miles of untouched wilderness. No roads, no houses, just trees and rolling hills. I should have felt at peace. Instead, I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, feeling that same uneasy sensation from the night before. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, I made sure to secure the cabin before dark. I bolted the door, checked the windows, and kept my lantern close. The fire crackled, the warmth filling the small space, but the unease never left me. Then, just like the night before, I woke up abruptly. The fire had burned low again, and the cabin was cloaked in darkness. But this time, I knew exactly what had woken me. The door handle was moving, not shaking violently, not being forced open, just a slow, testing turn. Someone was trying to see if it was unlocked. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I listened as the handle turned back and forth, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I strained my ears, listening for movement, for anything at all. Nothing, just the wind outside and the sound of my own pounding heart. I grabbed my flashlight and my hunting knife, feeling a cold sweat break out across my skin. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to make noise. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I sat there in the dark for what felt like an eternity, waiting. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, the first light of dawn was creeping through the windows. The door was still shut, the bolt still in place, but something felt different. I stepped outside, scanning the area, and then I saw it. There, in the dirt just beyond the porch, were footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet, leading from the trees to the porch, then back into the woods. I didn't waste time. I packed up my gear, threw everything into my truck, and left that place behind. I didn't stop driving until I hit the nearest town, hours away. When I finally pulled over, hands still gripping the wheel too tightly, I realized I had been holding my breath for most of the drive. I never reported it. What would I even say? There was no crime, no evidence of a real threat. Just footprints in the dirt and the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had been watching me, testing the door, waiting. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there in those woods, and I don't want to know. But I do know this: there are places in the world where you are truly, completely alone. Or at least you think you are. I drove up the narrow, winding road with both hands gripping the steering wheel tight. The headlights barely cut through the thick mist hanging over the trees, making everything ahead look like a shifting shadow. I had been driving for hours, the weight of exhaustion pressing on my chest, but I was finally close. The cabin was supposed to be just a couple of miles ahead, tucked deep in the woods where no one would bother me. That was the plan, at least. The idea of a solo trip had come to me a few weeks ago. I needed a break. Life had been too loud, too fast. Work had drained me, and my apartment in the city felt suffocating. A week alone in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and quiet, sounded like the perfect reset. I found a listing for a remote rental, small but cozy, completely off-grid, no cell service, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and my thoughts. By the time I reached the cabin, the night had fully settled in. The place was exactly as described, old but sturdy, with a small porch and a single yellow light glowing above the door. I killed the engine, and the silence that followed was immediate, heavy. No hum of passing cars, no voices, nothing but the wind rustling through the trees. I grabbed my bag and headed inside, flipping the light switch by the door. A single bulb in the center of the ceiling flickered to life, casting a dim glow over the wooden walls and old furniture. The air smelled of dust and pine. The cabin had one main room with a small kitchenette, a fireplace, and a bed pushed up against the far wall. A narrow door led to a tiny bathroom, and that was it. Simple, perfect. I locked the door behind me, double-checking it, then set my bag down. The silence was thick inside, even heavier than outside. I let out a breath, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. It was just the unfamiliarity of the place, I told myself. Nothing more. After a quick meal, I decided to call it a night. The drive had drained me, and I wanted to wake up early to explore. I changed into sweats, climbed into bed, and listened to the wind outside as I drifted off. I woke up to a sound. It wasn't the wind. I lay still, my breath caught in my throat, listening. The noise came again, a faint creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. It was inside. I was sure of it. My first thought was that someone had broken in. My heart pounded as I reached under the bed where I had tossed my flashlight. I clicked it on and swept the beam across the room. Everything looked exactly as I left it. The door was still locked. The windows were shut. I stayed awake for another hour, listening, waiting, but the noise never came again. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it. The silence, the isolation, it was getting to me. I shut my eyes and forced myself to sleep. The next day, I tried to shake the lingering unease by keeping busy. I spent the morning walking the woods, taking in the crisp air and the towering trees. The stillness out here was different from what I was used to, too deep, too complete. It made me feel like I was somewhere I didn't belong. By midday, I was back at the cabin, chopping some wood for the fireplace. That's when I noticed something off. The cabin door was unlocked. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. I always double-checked. My stomach twisted as I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was the same, untouched, like no one had been in here, but something felt different. The bed was just slightly out of place. The blanket had been pulled back, not the way I had left it. I checked every corner of the cabin, every crevice, but there was no one. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. That night, I set up a small barricade in front of the door. Just a chair, something that would make noise if moved. I went to bed gripping the flashlight in one hand, listening to the silence press in around me. Sometime after midnight, the noise came again. A single creak, then another, slow, deliberate, the sound of weight shifting on the old wooden floor. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed completely still, ears straining in the dark. Then I heard something else, something far worse. Breathing, not mine. It was soft, shallow, just beyond the bed. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel it. Something was there, watching. I gripped my flashlight and turned it on in a single motion, aiming the beam forward. Nothing. The room was empty. The door was still shut, the chair unmoved. But the feeling, the certainty was still there. I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. Whatever was happening here, I wasn't going to stick around and find out. I packed my things quickly, throwing everything back into my bag without care. I grabbed my keys, yanked the door open, and stopped dead. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the woods to my cabin door. Deep imprints in the damp earth. Bare feet. My stomach lurched. I looked around, but the woods were still and empty. Whoever or whatever had been here was gone now. Or hiding. I didn't wait. I ran to my car, threw my bag inside, and started the engine. Gravel kicked up under the tires as I sped down the winding road, heart hammering. I didn't look back. I made it back to the city before sunset, but I didn't feel safe until I was locked inside my apartment, surrounded by the hum of life again. Took days for the feeling of being watched to fade. I never told anyone what happened. What could I even say? There were no ghosts, no monsters, just the cold, undeniable truth that someone had been out there, watching me, waiting, and I had never seen them. I never went back to that cabin. I never even checked the listing again. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to that same sound. A single creak in the floorboards, and I wonder if I ever really left. I took the trip alone. I needed time away from everything. Work, people, the noise of the city. I'd spent years hiking and camping, so a few nights in a cabin deep in the woods seemed like exactly what I needed. I booked a small, off-grid place up in the mountains, miles from the nearest town. It was advertised as a hunting cabin, simple and functional. Just a wood stove, a cot, and an outhouse. No running water, no electricity. That was perfect for me. I parked my truck at the trailhead and hiked in. It was a good 3 miles through thick forest, the kind of place where the trees close in overhead, making it feel later in the day than it really is. The trail was rough but manageable, just a narrow path that cut through the undergrowth. My pack was heavy with supplies, enough for 4 days. I brought a rifle too, just in case. There were black bears in the area, maybe some cougars. Nothing I hadn't dealt with before. The cabin sat in a small clearing, tucked between pines and firs. It was old but sturdy, built from thick logs with a slanted metal roof. The door was reinforced, the windows covered with heavy shutters. It looked like the kind of place a hunter or trapper would use for the season and then leave behind. Inside, there was just enough space for the cot, a wood stove, and a small table. A stack of firewood sat neatly by the stove. There was no dust inside, which meant someone had been there recently. I assumed the owner came up every so often to keep it in shape. I spent the first day hiking around, getting familiar with the area. The forest was dense but quiet, aside from the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. No signs of large predators, though I did see some old deer tracks near a small stream. As the sun dipped low, I made my way back to the cabin, got a fire going, and settled in for the night. The silence was heavy out there. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned low, filling the cabin with a dim orange glow. I listened, ears straining. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just outside the cabin. Not the light, scurrying sounds of an animal, but the weight of something or someone moving with caution. I sat up carefully, my hand reaching for the rifle beside the cot. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting. A long stretch of silence followed. Then, from outside, the sound of wood scraping against wood. My eyes flicked to the door. The latch was secure. I forced myself to stay still, to listen. The noise didn't come again. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I let myself lie back down, the rifle close by. Maybe it was an animal, something big like a bear sniffing around. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came cold and gray. I stepped outside, scanning the area. Nothing looked out of place at first. Then I saw it. The pile of firewood had been disturbed. Some pieces had been moved, stacked differently than I'd left them. And there, in the dirt near the pile, was a boot print. Not mine. It was fresh. I told myself it could have been an old print, distorted by the damp ground. But I knew better. Someone had been there, watching, listening. I didn't like it. I thought about leaving, but I had 3 more nights booked, and I wasn't the type to scare easy. I'd stay 1 more night. If anything else happened, I'd hike back to the truck in the morning. The second night, I was more alert. I kept the rifle next to me, loaded and within reach. I listened hard to the sounds outside. The wind moved through the trees, branches creaking, but nothing else. Then, just past midnight, I heard the sound again. The slow, careful steps of someone moving around outside. I gripped the rifle, heart pounding. The steps moved toward the back of the cabin, near the window. I stayed completely still, listening. Then came the sound of the shutters moving, just slightly. Someone testing them. I acted fast. I jumped up, threw open the door, and stepped onto the porch, rifle raised. The clearing was empty. The trees stood still in the darkness, the forest beyond a black wall. My breath came fast, my skin prickling. I swept the area with my eyes, but I saw nothing. No movement, no sound. I stayed on the porch for what felt like an hour, rifle in hand. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No sound of someone running off into the trees. But I knew someone had been there. They were watching me, testing the cabin, seeing if I'd react. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my things. I had no intention of staying another night. I shouldered my pack, rifle slung over my back, and started down the trail. 1/2 mile from the cabin, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A fresh set of boot prints in the mud, leading away from the cabin. Not my prints, someone else's. They'd been walking the same trail just ahead of me. I slowed down, scanning the trees. The forest felt too quiet, too still. My grip on the rifle tightened. I kept walking, following the prints. They continued down the trail, but then, 100 yards ahead, they veered off into the woods. Whoever had been out there had stepped off the trail, into the trees, as if they were watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't look too hard. I just walked, fast. I kept my eyes ahead, forcing myself not to look over my shoulder. I knew if I did, I might see something I didn't want to see. By the time I reached my truck, my skin was crawling. I threw my gear in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I drove until I hit the highway, until the forest was miles behind me. I never looked back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I know they were watching me, and I know they were waiting for something. I never went back to that cabin. I never even tried to find out who owned it. Some places are better left alone. I rented the cabin because I needed a break. Work had been pushing me too hard, and I hadn't taken a real vacation in years. My boss liked to remind me that I was dependable, the one who never called off, never took sick days, never needed a breather. But I did. I needed it badly. So, I found this little place deep in the woods, miles from any town, off some barely maintained gravel road. The online listing called it secluded and peaceful. That was exactly what I wanted. No traffic, no city noise, no people. I arrived in the late afternoon. The drive up had been longer than expected, mostly because my GPS lost signal, and I had to rely on printed directions. The last few miles were slow, my tires crunching over loose gravel, dust billowing behind me. I had this nagging feeling the whole way up, a kind of pressure in my chest. Maybe it was just the long drive or my body adjusting to the isolation. I brushed it off. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Just a simple one-bedroom setup, wooden walls dark with age, a slanted tin roof, a wraparound porch. It looked exactly like something you'd imagine when you hear the word cabin. Inside, it smelled like old wood and something faintly damp. I checked the kitchen first, rustic but functional. There was a gas stove, a small fridge, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. A single light bulb dangled from the ceiling, buzzing faintly when I flipped it on. The living room area was just a couch and a fireplace. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with old paperbacks and yellowed magazines. The bedroom was plain, just a bed and a dresser. The mattress felt thin when I pressed down on it. There was a small window above the bed, its glass a little foggy from age or neglect. The bathroom was even smaller, just a toilet, sink, and a shower stall with a curtain that clung to itself like it hadn't been moved in years. It was simple, but it would do. I spent the first hour unpacking. Just the essentials. Food, clothes, my laptop, even though I doubted I'd have internet, and a couple of books. I had brought a small cooler with some drinks, and I placed it near the fridge, which hummed louder than I liked. When I stepped outside onto the porch, the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was quiet. Too quiet. I guess I wasn't used to real silence. Even in my apartment, there was always some kind of background noise, traffic, people talking, distant sirens. Here, there was nothing. Just my breathing and the occasional rustle of trees shifting in the wind. That first night, I sat on the porch with a beer in hand, watching the trees disappear into darkness. The night sky was massive out here, stars brighter than I'd seen in years. I should have felt at peace. Instead, I felt exposed, like something was watching. Not something supernatural, just something. I shook it off, blaming it on the quiet and the unfamiliar setting. I wasn't used to being alone like this. I went inside, locked the door, and checked the windows before heading to bed. The mattress was as uncomfortable as I expected, and the pillow felt lumpy. I lay there for what felt like an hour, staring at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it. something moving outside. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying through the underbrush. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching against the gravel path leading to the porch. My stomach twisted. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, right outside the front door. My body went rigid. I hadn't seen another person for miles. Who the hell would be out here? I waited, heart pounding so loud I thought it might give me away. Nothing happened. No knock, no voice, no attempt to open the door. Just silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe some animal had wandered too close. I eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning came, and I stepped onto the porch, scanning the ground. My stomach dropped. There were footprints in the dirt, barefoot. The prints led from the tree line to the porch, stopping just short of the steps. My hands went clammy. It had to be a mistake. Maybe I made them when I arrived? No, that didn't make sense. I had been wearing boots. These prints were fresh. I spent the day trying to shake it off. I went on a hike, took some pictures, tried to enjoy the isolation. But the whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, just beyond the trees. The feeling of being watched never left me. That night, I locked the door, checked the windows twice, and sat on the couch with a book I wasn't really reading. Every little sound made me flinch. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just outside the cabin. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a fireplace poker, and crept toward the door. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might choke me. I wanted to look outside, but every instinct screamed not to. Instead, I stood there, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin this time. Once, twice, then they stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, poker gripped in my hand, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bags so fast I almost forgot my phone charger. The air outside was heavy, the sky overcast. I loaded my things into the car, glancing at the footprints in the dirt. They were still there, a fresh set overlapping the ones from the night before. I slid into the driver's seat, turned the key. Nothing. The engine wouldn't even try to turn over. I swore under my breath, trying again. Still nothing. I checked my phone. No signal. My hands were shaking now. I popped the hood, though I knew I wouldn't find anything useful. I wasn't a mechanic. Everything looked fine. No chewed wires, no obvious problems. That was when I saw it. A single footprint on the hood of my car, barefoot, pressed into the dust. I felt my stomach drop. My knees went weak. Someone had been here. Someone had stood right where I was now, watching me. I didn't bother checking the rest of the car. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking. I didn't care how far the next town was. I wasn't staying. The walk was long. My nerves stretched so tight that every snap of a twig made my skin crawl. I didn't see anyone. I never heard another set of footsteps. But I knew someone had been watching me. Someone had been right there in the dark just beyond the trees. I reached the nearest gas station hours later, sunburned and exhausted. The attendant gave me a strange look when I asked for a tow truck. When the driver showed up and I told him where my car was, he hesitated. "That place," he said, "people don't stay there long." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I never went back. I never even looked at the listing again. Some places are meant to be empty. Some places aren't meant to be found. I had been driving for hours, winding through empty back roads, my GPS barely holding a signal. The sun had dipped below the tree line, leaving me with only my headlights cutting through the thickening darkness. The cabin was supposed to be remote, secluded, peaceful, a break from everything. I needed that. Work had been killing me, and I just wanted to sit in silence, drink cheap whiskey, and stare at the trees. The listing had described it as rustic but comfortable, a one-bedroom retreat deep in the woods, built decades ago but kept in good shape. The photos made it look simple, sturdy, place where nothing happened. That was exactly what I wanted. When I finally found the turnoff, a barely visible dirt path almost hidden by thick underbrush, I hesitated. It looked more like an overgrown hiking trail than a road. My car jolted over deep ruts, branches scraping against the sides like fingers dragging along the metal. The drive was longer than I expected. The woods swallowed everything, and soon, my headlights were the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Finally, the trees opened up, and there it was. The cabin was smaller than I thought it would be, just a boxy structure with a slanted roof and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were dark. There was no sign of life, no caretaker waiting to greet me, just trees pressing in from all sides. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs. The silence was thick, pressing. No wind, no distant hum of civilization. Just my own breathing and the occasional rustle from the underbrush. I grabbed my bag from the trunk, climbed the porch steps, and unlocked the door with the key that had been mailed to me a week before. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. The walls were rough-hewn logs, the floor uneven in spots. A single lamp in the corner gave off a dim, yellow glow. The furniture was minimal. A couch that looked older than me, a scratched-up wooden table, a wood-burning stove, and a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom and bathroom. It was exactly what I expected. I set my bag down and checked my phone. No service. I should have figured. I wasn't planning to use it much anyway. But the lack of signal made me feel cut off in a way that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Still, I shook it off, cracked open a bottle of whiskey, and settled into the lumpy couch. The first night was uneventful. I drank, listened to the sounds of the woods, and let my mind empty. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes when there's no street noise, no glowing screens, just pure darkness. When I woke up, the sun was already high, slanting through the thin curtains. I stretched, made coffee on the tiny propane stove, and stepped outside onto the porch. The forest felt different in the daylight, less oppressive. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance. I could see a narrow trail leading away from the cabin, barely more than a deer path. I hadn't noticed it the night before, twisted into the trees, disappearing fast. Something about it made my skin crawl, though I couldn't say why. I spent most of the day wandering around the property, getting a feel for the place. The trees were thick, their trunks wide and gnarled, some looking old enough to have been there before the cabin was even built. There was a small creek about a quarter-mile away, its water clear and cold. The air smelled clean, untouched. That night, things started feeling off. I was sitting on the porch, whiskey in hand, when I noticed it. The woods had gone silent. No wind, no birds, no insects, just thick, pressing stillness. I held my breath, listening, but there was nothing, not even the distant sound of the creek. The air felt heavy, the way it does before a storm, but the sky was clear. Then I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush, slow, deliberate, not the quick movements of an animal, but something heavier. Stopped, then started again, closer. I strained my eyes against the darkness, but my porch light barely reached past the clearing. My heart thumped in my chest, my body tensed. Probably a deer, I told myself. A bear, maybe, but I didn't move. I just sat there, holding my breath, waiting. Then it stopped. The silence stretched. I forced myself to exhale, set my glass down, and went inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself I was being stupid, that I was letting my imagination get to me. Still, I double-checked the windows, made sure the curtains were drawn, and sat in the dim light of the cabin, listening. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd wake up, heart pounding, convinced I had heard something. A footstep on the porch, a creak in the floorboards. But every time I strained to listen, there was nothing. The next morning, I went outside, searching for tracks. The ground was damp from the morning dew, but I didn't see anything unusual. No footprints, no trampled grass, Nothing to suggest anything had been near the cabin. The woods were alive again, birds calling to each other, the wind stirring the leaves. Felt normal, like nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, the same thing happened. The silence, the heavy air, the rustling, just beyond the reach of the porch light. I sat inside this time, watching the door, every muscle in my body tight. Hours passed, the sounds faded. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. Then the third night came. I had barely sat down when I heard it. Not rustling this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the trees just out of sight. My skin crawled. I turned off the lamp, creeping to the window, peeking out through the curtain. Nothing, but the footsteps continued. Closer now. My stomach clenched. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen, gripping it so tight my hand hurt. The footsteps reached the edge of the clearing, then stopped. Minutes stretched by. My breath came in shallow gulps. I stayed by the window, barely daring to move. Then, slowly, something stepped into the light. A man. Tall, thin, his clothes hanging loose, like they didn't quite fit. He stood just at the edge of the clearing, head tilted slightly, staring at the cabin. And me. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel his eyes. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked back into the trees, swallowed by the dark. I didn't sleep at all. As soon as the first light crept over the horizon, I threw my things into my bag, got in my car, and drove. The whole way back, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see him standing at the side of the road, watching me. I never went back, never checked the listing again. I don't know who he was, what he wanted, or if he was even real. But every so often, when I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, I swear I can still feel him watching. I don't know why I thought it would be a good idea to stay out here alone. Maybe I just wanted some quiet. Maybe I needed to prove something to myself. But now I wish I had never come at all. It started with the drive. The cabin sat deep in the woods, nearly an hour from the nearest town. I followed a long, winding road that seemed to get narrower with every mile, the trees pressing in closer. There were no streetlights, no houses, no signs of life, just the endless stretch of forest swallowing the road ahead. My phone lost service about halfway there, but I wasn't too worried. I had a map, and the directions were simple enough. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt a strange unease settle in my chest. It was smaller than I expected, weathered and worn, with paint peeling from the wooden walls. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, the steps creaking under my weight as I approached the door. The key was hidden under a loose stone beside the entrance, just as the rental listing had said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of aged wood. The cabin was simple. One main room with a kitchen against the far wall, a small bathroom, and a bedroom tucked away in the back. The furniture was old but sturdy. A sagging couch, a wooden dining table with mismatched chairs, and a rocking chair near the fireplace. There were no modern conveniences, no TV, no Wi-Fi, just an old radio sitting on the counter. The windows were small, covered with heavy curtains, and there was a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I unpacked, set up my things, and tried to settle in. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, read a few pages of a book, and went to bed early. The silence was almost overwhelming. No distant hum of cars, no neighbors, no city noises, just the occasional creak of the cabin and the whisper of wind through the trees. I slept uneasily, waking up several times to the sound of something moving outside. Probably just animals, I told myself. Just the woods doing what the woods do. The second day, I explored the area. There wasn't much to see. Just trees, endless and thick, stretching in every direction. I found an old shed behind the cabin, its door hanging slightly ajar. Inside, I saw rusted tools, a few stacks of firewood, and what looked like an animal trap covered in cobwebs. The smell of damp and decay was strong, so I didn't linger. As I walked back to the cabin, I felt something, an odd sensation, like I was being watched. But when I turned around, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. That night, the unease grew stronger. The noises outside were louder, closer. Twigs snapped, footsteps crunched against the dirt. I sat in bed, straining to hear, my heart pounding. Then, around midnight, a sound came from the porch, a slow, deliberate creak, like someone stepping onto the wood. I held my breath, creaked again. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. The cabin was pitch dark, the heavy curtains blocking out any moonlight. I listened. The sound didn't come again. Minutes passed. Maybe an animal, I thought. Maybe the wood shifting from the cold. I wanted to believe that, but I didn't sleep much after that. By the third day, I was exhausted. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it had gotten worse. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. I kept catching movement in my peripheral vision, quick flashes of something darting between trees. But whenever I turned my head, nothing was there. The woods were playing tricks on me, I told myself. I was alone. I had to be. That night, something changed. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again, that slow, careful creak of the porch steps. But this time, it didn't stop. The sound moved closer. Someone or something was walking across the porch, right outside my door. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. The cabin was silent except for that sound. Then came the soft, unmistakable scrape of something brushing against the door. A pause. Then a slow, deliberate knock. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Another knock, louder this time. I reached for my flashlight with shaking hands and flicked it on. The beam landed on the door. The doorknob didn't turn. The knocking didn't come again. But I knew someone or something was out there. I sat like that for what felt like hours, my body frozen, my ears straining for any sound. Eventually, the exhaustion overtook me. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the small cracks in the curtains. The cabin was quiet, but the feeling of wrongness was stronger than ever. I needed to leave. I threw my things into my bag, not even bothering to fold them. As I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. There, in the dirt just outside the porch, were footprints. Large, deep footprints leading from the woods to my door, but no tracks leading away. I didn't stop to think. I ran to my car, threw my bag into the back seat, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, failed. I tried again. Nothing. My hands were shaking as I turned the key over and over, my breath coming in short gasps. Finally, with a choking cough, the engine roared to life. I backed out so fast that my tires skidded against the dirt, sending up a cloud of dust. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached town, my heart still hammering. When I pulled into a gas station, I forced myself to breathe, to think. My phone still had no service. I asked the cashier if there was a mechanic nearby, and he directed me to a small shop a few blocks down. The mechanic took one look under my hood and frowned. "Where'd you say you were staying?" he asked. "Some old cabin up in the woods," I said. He wiped his hands on a rag, shaking his head. "Damn lucky your car started at all. Looks like someone messed with your engine. Fuel line was cut, but not all the way through." My blood ran cold. Someone had wanted me to stay there. I never went back. I never tried to find out who or what had been outside my door that night. I don't want to know. All I know is that I got out, and I'm never going back. I pulled off the highway onto the narrow gravel road, my tires crunching over loose stone as I made my way deeper into the woods. The sun was just starting to set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. My truck's headlights bounced along the uneven path, illuminating the narrow road ahead. According to the old man I rented the place from, the cabin was about 5 miles down the stretch, tucked deep enough in the trees that I wouldn't have to worry about any neighbors. That was exactly what I wanted. Work had drained me these past few months, and I just needed a break. No emails, no phone calls, no people. Just me, a stocked fridge, a few books, and the quiet of the woods. The listing made it sound perfect. An old but well-kept cabin, a small lake just a short walk away, and plenty of firewood stacked out back. It sounded almost too good to be true. The further I drove, the worse the road got. Ruts deep enough to jostle my truck, patches of mud that made my tires spin before catching traction again. The trees seemed to press in closer, branches scraping against the sides of my truck. Finally, just as the last bit of daylight faded, I saw it. A dark shape against the trees, just barely visible in my high beams. The cabin. I parked a few feet from the porch and killed the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the silence settle around me. No cars, no hum of electricity, just the sound of the wind pushing through the trees. Felt good. When I stepped out, the air was cooler than I expected. I grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat and made my way to the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, but the cabin itself seemed solid. The key was right where the old man said it would be, taped under the third step. I let myself in and flicked on the light. The cabin was simple but nice. Wooden floors, a small kitchen, a couch facing a stone fireplace, and a single bedroom off to the side. The air smelled of dust and old wood, but it was cozy. I dropped my bag by the couch and started unpacking. The first night was uneventful. I made some dinner, had a few beers, and sat on the porch for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. Eventually, I went to bed, enjoying the kind of deep, uninterrupted sleep I hadn't had in months. The next morning, I decided to check out the lake. The path leading down to the water was overgrown, but I found it easily enough. The lake itself was beautiful, calm, still water reflecting the sky, surrounded by thick trees. I stood there for a while, just taking it in, before heading back to the cabin. That's when I noticed something strange. The front door was open. I was sure I had closed it. I even remembered locking it, but now it stood wide open, shifting slightly in the breeze. My first thought was that maybe I hadn't latched it properly, but when I stepped inside, I knew something was off. My bag was open. I didn't leave it that way. My clothes were still there, nothing was missing, but the way the bag sat, it wasn't how I left it. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, scanning the room. Everything else looked untouched. The cabin was small enough that there weren't many places for someone to hide, but I checked anyway. Under the bed, in the bathroom, even outside around the porch. Nothing. Maybe I had just forgotten to lock the door. Maybe the wind had blown it open, and I was making a big deal out of nothing. I locked the door again, double-checking it this time, and pushed the thought out of my head. I spent the rest of the day fishing at the lake, reading on the porch, and doing my best to relax. By nightfall, I had almost convinced myself it had been my mistake, until I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, not an animal too heavy for that. Someone was outside. I reached for my flashlight and crept out of bed, moving as quietly as I could. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. I stepped toward the window and peeked through the curtain. Nothing. The porch was empty. I stood there, holding my breath, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the wind in the trees. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it again. A single, slow step. This time, it came from the side of the cabin. I spun around, my pulse hammering in my ears. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I reached for the fireplace poker, the only weapon I could find, and stood frozen in the darkness, listening. Minutes passed. The footsteps stopped, and then silence. I barely slept that night. I kept the poker next to me, dozing off only to jolt awake at the slightest sound. When morning finally came, I stepped outside, scanning the area around the cabin. That's when I saw them. Footprints, large, deep ones in the damp soil, circling the cabin. They led from the tree line to the porch, then around the sides, disappearing back into the woods. Whoever had been out there had walked around the cabin multiple times. I packed my bag in minutes. I didn't care how much time I had left on my rental. I was leaving. As I loaded my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, relief washing over me as I pulled onto the gravel road. But just before I rounded the bend, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw him, a man, standing just at the edge of the trees. Not moving, not hiding, just standing there watching me go. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove straight out of those woods and didn't look back. Even now, weeks later, I don't know what he wanted or why he was there. But I do know one thing for certain. I was not alone in those woods. I never wanted to go to that cabin. It wasn't my idea. My brother, David, had been pestering me for months, saying we needed to get away for a while, just the two of us. Ever since Dad passed, he said I had been distant. He wasn't wrong, but I didn't see how a trip to some rundown place in the woods was going to help. I preferred keeping my mind occupied, not sitting around in silence. But I went anyway, mostly to shut him up. The drive was long and boring. David drove most of the way while I stared out the window, watching the trees blur together. The roads got worse the further we went, turning from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. Eventually, we reached a narrow path barely wide enough for the truck. The trees were thick here, stretching high and closing in on both sides. Felt like we were heading into a different world. The cabin itself was exactly what I expected. Old, small, and falling apart. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I followed David to the front door. He unlocked it and pushed it open, revealing a dusty, dimly lit interior. There was a musty smell, like old wood and something else I couldn't place. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Too quiet. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees. Just stillness. It made my skin crawl. "Home sweet home," David said, clapping me on the back. He was grinning, but I could tell he was nervous too. Inside, there wasn't much to look at. A small living room with a worn-out couch and a fireplace. A tiny kitchen with outdated appliances, and a single bedroom with 2 old beds. The bathroom was barely big enough to turn around in. The place felt abandoned, like no one had set foot in it for years. We unpacked, and David went about setting up a fire while I wandered outside. The forest surrounded the cabin, dense and unwelcoming. The air was thick, damp. I had that strange feeling in my stomach, the kind that tells you something isn't right, but I pushed it down. I told myself I was being stupid. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bed was uncomfortable. The blankets smelled like mildew, and every sound outside made me jump. I could hear something moving in the trees. Probably animals, I told myself. Still, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then I heard it. A single, sharp knock. It wasn't at the door. Came from the wall, just beside my bed. My breath caught in my throat. I waited, listening. Silence. I told myself it was the old wood settling, that I was imagining things. I rolled onto my side, pulling the blanket up to my chin, and forced myself to sleep. The next day was uneventful. We hiked, fished, did all the things David insisted would help, but the whole time I felt uneasy. I kept catching movement out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned, there was nothing there. At one point, while fishing, I got that same sick feeling in my stomach, like something was watching me. I looked over at David, but he seemed fine, relaxed even. That night, I heard the knocking again. Same spot. 3 short raps, like someone tapping their knuckles against the wood. My body tensed. I didn't move. I just lay there, heart pounding, waiting for it to happen again. Didn't. I was exhausted the next morning. I told David about it, but he brushed it off. "Old cabins make noises," he said. "You're overthinking it." I let it go. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just on edge. That night, I made sure to stay awake. I wanted to hear it again, to prove to myself that it was nothing. Came later this time, around 3 in the morning. 3 knocks, same as before. I held my breath, waiting. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from outside, circling the cabin. My whole body went rigid. I strained to hear, my ears picking up every shift in the leaves, every creak of the old wood. The footsteps stopped near the front door, then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I waited for something, anything, but nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground was damp from the night's rain, and there were footprints in the mud. They weren't animal prints. They were human, barefoot. I called David over. He frowned at the prints, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe some local kids messing with us," he said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. We decided to leave that afternoon. I didn't argue. Something was wrong with that place. I didn't need more convincing. As we packed up, I felt it again, that sick feeling in my stomach, stronger this time. I glanced at the tree line. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing there, just a dark shape among the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. We got in the truck and drove away. I didn't look back. We didn't talk much on the drive home. David kept checking the mirrors, like he expected to see something following us. I didn't ask if he saw anything. I didn't want to know. We never went back to that cabin. Never even talked about it again. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up to the sound of knocking. 3 short raps, always from the wall beside my bed. I tell myself it's just in my head, just a memory, but deep down I know better. It started with a favor. My uncle had bought an old hunting cabin deep in the woods a few years ago, and he wanted me to check on it. He and my dad had gone up there every fall, but this year my uncle was out of state for work, and my dad was recovering from surgery. "Just a weekend," my mom said when she handed me the keys. "Make sure no pipes burst. See if the roof held up through winter." Things like that. I had no reason to say no. I was off work, had no major plans, and I figured a weekend alone in the woods wouldn't be the worst thing. No cell service, no distractions. Maybe I'd read a book, chop some firewood, enjoy the quiet. The drive was easy at first. Highway, then a 2-lane road through small towns, then a narrower road into the woods. By the time I turned onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The headlights bounced off branches and deep tire ruts. The last mile or so was slow, the truck's tires slipping in the loose gravel and mud. When I finally pulled up, the cabin was just as I remembered. A squat, 1-story building with a small porch and a slanted metal roof. The windows were dark. A woodshed sat off to the side, half full of logs. The forest pressed in around the clearing, tall pines and bare branches tangled overhead. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled like dust and old wood. The last time anyone had been here was probably last fall. I flipped the light switch. Nothing. "Right?" I muttered. The power was off. I had to turn on the generator out back. I left my bags by the door and grabbed the flashlight from my truck. The generator sat behind the cabin, a rusty old thing that my uncle swore still worked fine. I checked the fuel tank, pulled the cord a few times, and it rumbled to life. A moment later, the porch light flickered on. Inside, I checked the propane stove. Clicked on without issue. The water pump groaned but started running. Everything seemed fine. I ate a quick meal from a can, lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, and settled into the creaky armchair with a book. The first night was uneventful. Just the usual sounds of the woods, wind in the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. At one point, I thought I heard something moving outside, but when I looked, I saw nothing, just darkness beyond the tree line. I slept light, waking up every hour or so, listening. But nothing ever happened. The second day, I did my checklist. Walked around the cabin, checked the roof, the gutters, the woodpile. Everything was fine. I chopped more firewood, explored the woods a bit, tried to enjoy the silence. It was when I was splitting logs in the afternoon that I got the first uneasy feeling. a prickling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I stopped, axe in hand, and scanned the trees. Nothing, just stillness. No wind, no movement. Even the birds were quiet. I shrugged it off and went inside. As the evening stretched on, the feeling didn't leave. Every time I looked out a window, I half expected to see something staring back. The second night was worse. The sounds started around midnight. The thud outside, heavy, deliberate. Then another, like something moving just beyond the porch. I lay in bed, listening. My heart pounded. My uncle had mentioned bears coming around sometimes, but this didn't sound like a bear. No snuffling, no scratching, just slow, steady footsteps. Then a sound at the door, a creak like weight pressing against it. I held my breath. The rifle was across the room, leaning against the wall, too far to grab without making noise. The door handle rattled. I shot up, heart hammering. Who the hell would be out here? I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the window beside the door, trying to see. Nothing, just the porch and the trees beyond. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I barely slept. Morning came. I stepped onto the porch, half expecting to see tracks. Nothing, just damp earth and scattered leaves. I told myself it was an animal, the wind, something explainable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That afternoon, I hiked to the ridge about a mile away, where the old fire tower stood. I climbed up, hoping for cell service. Nothing, but I could see the whole valley, endless trees stretching in every direction. Then I saw it. Smoke, a thin wisp rising from the trees, too far to be my cabin. Someone else was out here. I climbed down fast and started back. My gut was tight. There shouldn't be anyone out here. The nearest town was over 20 miles away. No marked trails, no campsites, just wilderness. By the time I got back, the sun was setting. The uneasy feeling had grown worse. I locked the door, stoked the fire, kept the rifle close. The sounds started again that night, but this time they weren't outside. A creak in the kitchen, a floorboard shifting under weight. I sat up, gripping the rifle. The fire flickered. Shadows stretched across the walls. Silence. Then another sound. Closer. My throat went dry. I flicked the flashlight on and swept the beam across the room. Nothing. I waited, listened, and then, so quietly I almost thought I imagined it. A breath. Not mine. I lunged for the lantern, turned it up full. The light chased the shadows back, and the cabin was empty. I didn't sleep after that. At dawn, I packed my bags. I didn't check the pipes, didn't double-check the roof. I threw everything into the truck, started the engine, and left without looking back. When I reached the main road, my phone got service again. I called my uncle, told him I checked everything, said it all looked fine. I didn't tell him about the sounds, or the door handle, or the breath in the dark. I just said the cabin was in good shape, and that I wasn't going back. I was never the kind of person to believe in bad luck or omens. The world made sense to me in a straightforward way. Actions had consequences, and most things could be explained if you looked hard enough. But what happened to me that winter up in the mountains changed something in me. I don't tell this story often, mostly because I still don't understand all of it myself. But I remember every moment of it, and I know I always will. I had been looking for a place to be alone for a while. Life had been piling up on me. Work stress, personal issues, the kind of exhaustion that sits in your bones and doesn't leave. I needed a break from it all. My cousin owned a cabin up in the mountains, a good few miles from any main roads, and even further from the nearest town. It was the kind of place people used for hunting or just getting away from the world. He hadn't used it in a while, and when I asked if I could stay there for a week, he barely hesitated before giving me the okay. He warned me, though, the place was old, isolated, and the winter months could be brutal. But I didn't care. I wanted the silence. I wanted to be far away from everything and everyone. The drive up there was long, the roads winding through the thick woods that seemed to swallow the light as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Snow had started to fall by the time I reached the last stretch, a narrow dirt road that cut through the trees. The cabin wasn't much to look at, just a small wooden structure with a porch out front, a chimney poking up from the roof, and a single window facing the driveway. But it had what I needed: shelter, a wood stove for heat, and enough supplies to last the week. I spent the first evening settling in. The cabin had a basic setup: a small kitchen, a main living area with a couch and a fireplace, a single bedroom, and a cramped bathroom. Smelled like dust and old wood. There was no electricity, just a few battery-powered lanterns and a stack of candles left on the kitchen counter. I lit a fire in the stove, unpacked my bags, and sat in the quiet, feeling the weight of the world slowly slipping off my shoulders. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep quickly, the exhaustion from the drive catching up with me. The wind howled through the trees outside, but it was nothing I wasn't expecting. The real trouble started the next day. I woke up to find the front door slightly open, not wide, but just enough for the cold to seep in. I was sure I had locked it. I checked it twice before going to bed. I told myself it must not have latched properly, so I shut it tight and made sure it was locked. The snow outside was undisturbed, no footprints or signs of anything unusual. Just the wind, I told myself, just the cold shifting the wood. By the second night, I started feeling like something was off. The cabin creaked more than it should have. I knew old buildings made noise, especially in the cold, but this was different. It sounded like movement, like weight shifting on the floorboards, but never in a way I could pinpoint. I convinced myself I was just on edge from being alone in the woods. Then I heard it. Around midnight, just as I was about to fall asleep, a sound came from outside. A steady, rhythmic knocking. 3 slow knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. I froze. My first thought was that someone had found their way up here. Maybe a lost hiker or a hunter needing shelter. But who would be out here this late? And why would they knock like that? I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window. I couldn't see anything, just darkness and the snow-covered ground. I stood there for a long time, waiting, listening. Nothing, just the wind. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check for tracks. There weren't any, just untouched snow. That was the part that got me. If someone had been out there knocking, they would have left footprints. The snow was fresh. It should have shown something. I told myself it must have been a tree branch or something falling against the cabin. But that didn't explain the rhythm. That didn't explain the way it had sounded deliberate. That night, I locked the door, double-checked it, and propped a chair under the handle just in case. I kept the flashlight by my bed. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, rattling the walls. I lay awake, listening. Then, just past midnight, the knocking came again. 3 slow knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. It was closer this time. Not on the front door. On the wall. The side of the cabin where there weren't any windows. My breath caught in my throat. I held the flashlight tight, my hands shaking. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. And then the worst part, the sound of the doorknob turning. It was slow, testing, careful, deliberate movement. Then a pause. Then a slight push against the door. The chair held. The door didn't open. I stayed frozen in my bed, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know how long I lay there, listening, waiting. At some point, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, everything was quiet. The door was still locked, the chair still in place. I stepped outside, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks, for anything. Nothing, just the wind, the trees, the untouched snow. I left that afternoon. I packed my bags, threw everything into the truck, and didn't look back. I never told my cousin what happened. I didn't have an explanation, just a feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, that something was watching, that if I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't have left at all. I don't know what was out there. I don't think I ever want to know. I told myself it was just to clear my head, to get some space from everything: work, people, noise. But even before I stepped foot on that rotten porch, I knew it was a mistake. The cabin belonged to my uncle. It had been in the family for years, tucked away deep in the woods, miles from any town. It wasn't some cozy getaway. It was a plain wooden structure, one room, no electricity, no running water. Just a cot, a wood stove, and an old rocking chair that creaked even when no one was sitting in it. I hadn't been there in years. Not since I was a teenager, back when my uncle used to take me hunting. He always said the woods had a way of swallowing things: noise, time, even people, if they weren't careful. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me. Damp wood, old ashes, something else underneath it all. Something sour, something wrong. I told myself it was just the smell of a place that had been shut up too long. I set my bag down by the cot and went out back to chop some wood. The axe was still there, right where my uncle always left it, stuck deep in the old stump. I had to work it free, twisting it back and forth before the damp would finally let go. The trees pressed in close around the clearing, thicker than I remembered. The air was heavy, still. Even the birds were quiet. The only sound was my own breathing and the dull thud of the axe biting into the logs. I should have left that first night. I built a small fire, made some instant coffee on the wood stove, and sat on the cot, staring at the floor. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was thick, like a pressure against my skull. I kept thinking I heard something just outside. A soft shuffle, the creak of a branch. I told myself it was just animals. The woods were full of them. But then there was the knocking. Started just after I laid down. 3 sharp raps against the far wall of the cabin. Not at the door, not at the window, the far wall, the one facing the woods. I sat up fast, my heart hammering. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too steady. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it through the window, but the trees were too close, the night too thick. I told myself it was just the wind. I told myself a lot of things. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. They were small, not a child's, but smaller than mine. The prints circled the cabin, stopping at the walls, the windows, the door. I felt sick. I told myself it was just some drifter passing through. Maybe someone lost, someone looking for shelter. But the prints led away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees where the ground turned to thick moss. I packed my things. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I told myself I was being stupid, paranoid. I told myself I'd stay one more night. That night, I locked the door, bolted it, wedged a chair under the handle. The knocking came again. This time it moved. First the far wall, then the side of the cabin, then the front. Slow, steady knocks, circling me. I sat in the cot, clutching the axe, my breath shallow. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. At some point, it stopped. I didn't sleep. I waited for the sun, and as soon as light broke through the trees, I was up, grabbing my bag. I yanked open the door and froze. The chair I had wedged under the handle was back in place. Something had been inside. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I drove until I hit the highway, until I saw buildings, cars, people. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. I left the cabin behind. I won't go back. I won't make that mistake again. I was never one for staying in the woods alone, but the opportunity to house sit my uncle's cabin for a week seemed harmless enough. He needed someone to watch over the place while he was out of town, and I could use some time away from the noise of the city. The idea of being alone in the wilderness didn't bother me much at first. I figured it would be a peaceful retreat. Just me, the trees, and a good book. I packed enough supplies for the week and drove up early in the morning. The drive itself took about 3 hours, winding through narrow roads that snaked between tall pines and empty stretches of land. The deeper I got into the woods, the less reception I had on my phone, but I expected that. Uncle Mike had warned me that the signal up there was spotty at best. The last 20 minutes of the drive were on a dirt path, bumpy enough that I had to slow down to avoid rattling my car apart. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked just as I remembered: small, rustic, and surrounded by nothing but thick forest on all sides. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The place smelled of old wood and dust, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. It was a simple setup: one large open space that served as the living room and kitchen, a small bedroom in the back, and a bathroom that had just enough running water to make it functional. I spent the first hour unpacking, putting my food in the tiny fridge, and making sure the place was in order. By late afternoon, the sky started turning orange, and the woods outside became eerily quiet. I had noticed that about the area before, how silent it got once the sun started to set. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just dead stillness. I tried to ignore the feeling of unease creeping in. I made dinner, read a little, then locked up and went to bed early. That first night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint, like something moving through the trees. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal and forced myself to go back to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept my eyes shut, listening. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. It wasn't the random scurrying of a small animal. It was heavier, more careful. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. After what felt like forever, the sound faded and the silence returned. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, morning light was seeping through the curtains. The second day passed uneventfully. I went for a short walk around the property, staying close to the cabin. I found nothing unusual, just trees, a small clearing behind the cabin, and a narrow trail that disappeared deeper into the woods. I spent most of the day reading and trying to enjoy the quiet, but as evening crept in, the uneasy feeling returned. That night, the sounds outside came again. This time, they were closer. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Slow, deliberate footsteps circled the cabin, stopping just outside my window. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. I wanted to convince myself it was just my imagination, but then something tapped against the glass. Just one tap, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't look. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds moved away. The crunch of leaves faded into the distance, and eventually, everything was still again. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I went outside, walking around the cabin with cautious steps. I expected to find tracks, but the ground was undisturbed. There was no sign that anything or anyone had been there, but I knew what I heard. By the third night, I was on edge. I locked every door and window, double-checked them, then sat awake with a knife by my side. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me. I told myself it was just the woods playing tricks, but deep down, I didn't believe that. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time, they didn't circle the cabin. They stopped right outside the front door. Something scraped against the wood. A slow, dragging sound. Then the doorknob rattled. I gripped the knife so tightly my hand ached. My body was frozen, every muscle tense. I wanted to get up, to check the locks again, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The rattling stopped. Then, after a long moment of silence, footsteps retreated into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I made a decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bags in record time, tossing everything into my car without caring how much noise I made. I locked up the cabin and got into the driver's seat, my hands still shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The car didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, checked the battery connections, everything looked fine, but the engine refused to turn over. Panic clawed at my throat as I slammed the hood shut and scanned the empty road ahead. I had no cell service, no way to call for help. The only way out was to walk. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with the essentials, and started down the dirt path. I kept my pace quick, trying not to think about the fact that whatever had been outside my cabin could still be out there. The sun was high, but the trees cast long shadows, making everything feel darker than it should have. After an hour of walking, I heard it. Footsteps, not behind me but ahead. I stopped, heart hammering, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped too. I turned, considering running back to the cabin, but then I saw it, movement between the trees. A figure, standing completely still. Too far to make out details, but close enough that I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The trees blurred around me, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet drowned out by the sound of my own breathing. I didn't look back. By some miracle, I reached the highway. A car passed a minute later, and I flagged it down. The driver was an older man who took one look at me and knew something was wrong. He didn't ask many questions, just drove me to the nearest town where I could get help. When I returned with a tow truck the next day, my car started on the first try. The mechanic found nothing wrong with it. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle stopped going too, said he just didn't feel right being there anymore. He never asked me what happened, and I never told him. Some things are better left alone. I don't know why I agreed to watch the cabin for 2 weeks. Maybe it was the promise of solitude, maybe the need to get away. My coworker, James, had asked me as a favor. He and his wife owned a small place deep in the woods, about an hour from town. They mostly used it during hunting season, but they needed someone to check in while they were away visiting family. I didn't have much going on, so I agreed. I packed up my truck and drove out there on a Sunday afternoon. The last stretch of road turned from gravel to dirt, winding through thick trees. It was mid-October, and the leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the bare branches stretching overhead. The air smelled like damp earth and wood smoke. The sky was gray, threatening rain. The cabin sat back from the road, small but sturdy. A wraparound porch, a single chimney, and a stack of firewood beside the door. James had left the key under a loose board on the porch, just as he'd said. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a kitchen and sitting area, a wood stove, and a small bedroom in the back. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a radio and a few shelves of books. The walls were covered in hunting trophies. Deer heads, a bear pelt, even a couple of old traps. It was quiet, too quiet. No traffic noise, no hum of electricity, just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the wood settling. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window watching the woods. The first couple of days were uneventful. I read, went for walks, and wrote a little in my journal. At night, the temperature dropped fast, and I kept the fire going. The nights were the worst. The darkness out there was different, heavier. It was the kind of dark where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Every little sound outside made my nerves jump. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. More than once, I shone my flashlight through the window, expecting to see something or someone, but there was never anything there. On the fourth night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but these were heavy, deliberate, not the quick, darting steps of a four-legged creature. I stayed still, listening. The steps moved around the side of the cabin, slow and steady. Then they stopped right outside the bedroom window. My heart pounded. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed and flicked it on, aiming it at the window. Nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of trees. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I checked around the cabin but saw no tracks, nothing disturbed. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe a raccoon or a coyote, but something didn't sit right. The following night, it happened again. This time, the footsteps came closer, stopping at the front porch. I heard the wooden planks creak under the weight. My hands shook as I grabbed my hunting knife from the nightstand. The sound of breathing, slow and steady, just outside the door. I stayed frozen, barely daring to breathe myself. After what felt like hours, the sound stopped. I waited another 10 minutes before I moved, creeping to the window. Still nothing. The next day, I found something by the steps. A boot print, half smudged in the dirt. Not mine. Not James's either. He hadn't been out here in weeks. I took my shotgun from the rack above the fireplace and kept it close for the rest of the day. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the door, gun resting on my lap. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. At some point, exhaustion won and I dozed off. I woke up to the sound of the door handle turning. I shot up, my heart in my throat. The handle rattled again, harder this time. I raised the shotgun aimed at the door. Then silence. Whoever was out there had realized it was locked. But they didn't leave. They stood there, waiting. The air felt thick, pressing down on me. I gripped the gun tighter. Then, a slow, deliberate tap on the wood. 3 knocks. Not rushed, not hesitant. A signal. I didn't respond. I stayed still, breathing through my nose. My finger hovered over the trigger. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. Slow, heavy steps fading into the trees. I barely breathed the rest of the night. When the first light of morning crept through the window, I packed my things in record time. I wasn't staying another night. James could find someone else. As I loaded my truck, I looked back at the cabin one last time. A single boot print sat in the dirt by the door. I never went back. I should have known something wasn't right the moment I stepped onto the dirt road leading to the cabin. It was late October, and the trees on either side of the road were mostly bare, their branches clawing at the sky like bony fingers. The air was sharp and still, the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of your own breathing. My truck's tires crunched over fallen leaves, and the sound felt too loud in the stillness. The cabin was deep in the woods, a good 20-minute drive from the nearest paved road. My friend Dave had let me borrow it for the weekend, said it would be good for me to get away for a bit. I wasn't one to turn down free solitude. Work had been hell lately, and I needed the break. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, a single-story structure made of dark wood, with a small porch and a stone chimney. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, just listening. No birds, no wind, nothing. I told myself it was just the time of year. Everything was settling in for winter. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and grabbed my bag from the truck. The key was under a loose brick on the porch, just like Dave said. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and I was met with the musty smell of old wood and dust. Inside, the place was simple. A couch, a coffee table, a wood-burning stove, and a small kitchen in the corner. A single hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. I dropped my bag on the couch and walked through, flipping on lights. Everything was normal, just an old cabin. I set my phone on the kitchen counter. No service, which I expected. I downloaded some movies beforehand, just in case, but the plan was to just enjoy the quiet. A couple of nights with nothing but a book and a bottle of whiskey sounded perfect. After unpacking, I stepped outside to bring in some firewood. The shed was about 20 yards from the cabin, just past the tree line. As I walked, I felt it again, that strange quiet. It wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a presence in itself, thick and unnatural. I shook it off, telling myself I was just getting used to being alone out here. The firewood was stacked against the wall inside the shed, neatly cut and dry. I grabbed an armful and turned back toward the cabin. That's when I noticed something. There was a path leading deeper into the woods, barely visible between the trees. I hadn't seen it before, and something about it felt off. The dirt was smooth, as if recently disturbed. No leaves had gathered on it, unlike the rest of the forest floor. I stared at it for a moment longer before shaking my head and heading back inside. That night, I made a fire, cooked some canned soup, and settled onto the couch with my book. The warmth from the fire made the cabin feel cozy, and for a while, I forgot about the strange silence outside. But around midnight, something woke me up. It wasn't a sound, exactly. More like a shift in the air, a change in pressure that made my ears pop. I sat up, rubbing my face, and listened. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. I glanced toward the window, and that's when I saw it. The trees at the edge of the clearing weren't as dark as they should have been. Something pale was standing among them, just barely visible in the dim light of the moon. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to stay still, watching. It didn't move. It just stood there. I blinked hard, convinced I was just seeing things. When I looked again, it was gone. I let out a slow breath and shook my head. Just my imagination. I had been alone for less than a day, and already I was seeing things. I threw another log onto the fire and lay back down, forcing myself to sleep. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. The sun was up, and everything looked normal again. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and took in the woods around me. But then I saw the path again. And this time, there were footprints. They weren't mine. I hadn't gone near the path, and these tracks were fresh. Barefoot. The prints led from the woods to the clearing and stopped just a few feet from my cabin. I swallowed hard, my skin crawling. Someone had been here, watching me. The rational part of my brain told me it was probably just some hunter or hiker who had wandered too close. But why barefoot? And why stop so close to the cabin without coming all the way? I shook it off and decided to ignore it. Maybe I was overthinking things. I went about my day, chopping more wood, fishing at the small creek a mile from the cabin. Anything to keep myself busy. That night, I locked the door, something I hadn't bothered to do before. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up, certain I had heard something. A branch snapping, leaves rustling. Every time I sat up, there was nothing but the quiet darkness outside. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. A single, slow step on the porch. I didn't move. My body was frozen. My breath caught in my throat. Another step, then another. Whoever it was, they were taking their time. I reached for the knife I had left on the nightstand. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, listening. A slow, deliberate scratch against the wood. I had had enough. I shot out of bed, flipped on the light, and threw open the door, knife in hand. Nothing. The porch was empty. The clearing was empty. The footprints from earlier were still there, but no new ones. I felt exposed, standing there in the doorway, so I stepped back inside and locked the door again. Sleep wasn't going to happen, so I sat in the chair by the window, knife in my lap, and waited for morning. By sunrise, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to be around when it decided to do more than just scratch at my door. I packed up, doused the fire, and threw my bag into the truck. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I glanced one last time at the woods. The path was gone. No footprints. No sign it had ever been there. Just an unbroken line of trees, silent as ever. I didn't wait to think about it. I started the truck and drove, not looking back until I was miles away. Back on the paved road, surrounded by the familiar hum of distant traffic. When I got back to town, I told Dave I had left early. Didn't tell him why. He just shrugged and said he hadn't been up there in years. Anyway, I never went back. I should have never gone to that cabin. Looking back, I don't know what made me think it was a good idea. Maybe I just needed a break from everything. The noise, the people, the stress of everyday life. I'd always liked being alone, and the thought of a quiet week in the woods seemed perfect. No cell service, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. But now, I can't stop thinking about what happened out there. I found the place online. It was an old hunting cabin, miles away from the nearest town. The ad said it had the basics: a bed, a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a well for water. That was all I needed. The price was cheap, and the owner didn't ask many questions. He just sent me directions and told me to bring plenty of supplies. The drive out took longer than I expected. The roads got worse the farther I went. First pavement, then gravel, then dirt. My car bounced over deep potholes, and tree branches scraped against the windows. I kept checking the directions, making sure I hadn't taken a wrong turn. It felt like I had been driving forever when I finally saw it. A small, weathered cabin in a clearing, surrounded by dense trees. I parked and got out, stretching my legs. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already starting to sink behind the trees. The cabin looked older than it had in the pictures. The wood was gray and worn, the porch sagging slightly, but it was still standing, and that was all that mattered. Inside, the cabin was simple. One room with a bed against the wall, a wood stove in the corner, and a small kitchen area with a gas stove and a sink. There was an old wooden table with 2 chairs and a shelf stocked with a few mismatched dishes. A door in the back led to a tiny bathroom with a rust-stained sink and a toilet. No shower, just a metal basin for washing up. Everything smelled musty, like it hadn't been used in a long time. I spent the first hour unpacking. I had brought everything I'd need: canned food, a flashlight, extra batteries, and enough firewood to last the week. The well was a short walk from the cabin, and the water looked clean enough. I filled a pot and set it on the stove to boil. As night fell, the woods outside turned completely black. No streetlights, no distant glow from a nearby town, just darkness pressing in from all sides. I sat at the table, eating cold beans from a can, listening to the sounds outside. The wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I heard something moving. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I told myself it was nothing to worry about. The first night, I barely slept. The bed was hard, and the silence was too heavy. Every creak of the cabin made me tense up. I kept hearing noises outside, soft rustling, twigs snapping. I told myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, standing just beyond the tree line, watching. By the 3rd day, the feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, it had gotten worse. I tried to ignore it, keeping myself busy by chopping wood and hiking around the area. But every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. I would stop, turn around, scan the trees. Nothing, but the feeling never left. Then I started finding things. Small things, but enough to put me on edge. A pile of rocks stacked neatly near the porch, something I hadn't done. A piece of rope hanging from a low branch, swinging slightly as if it had just been touched. Footprints in the dirt near the well, not mine. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the footprints were old. Maybe an animal had knocked over the rocks. But deep down, I knew better. Someone else was out here. That night, I locked the door and shoved the table in front of it. The cabin had no curtains, and I hated how exposed I felt with the windows open to the darkness outside. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Every sound made my heart pound. The wind howling through the trees, the creak of the porch, then something different, a soft tap, then another, like fingers lightly drumming against the wooden wall. I held my breath. The tapping continued, moving slowly along the outside of the cabin. Someone was circling it, knocking as they went. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it so tightly my hand ached. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then, from the other side of the cabin, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving away into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed up my things as fast as I could, throwing everything into my bag. As I stepped outside, the woods were silent. Too silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. The air felt thick, heavy, like the moment before a storm. I walked to my car, heart pounding. The second I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. The driver's seat was wet. Dark, muddy footprints covered the floor. Someone had been inside. My keys were still in my pocket, but the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever had been watching me had been inside my car. I didn't stop to think. I threw my bag in the back, started the engine, and tore out of there, speeding down the narrow dirt road. My hands were shaking, my pulse racing. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing in the road, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just trees, endless trees. I drove straight home, locked my doors, and sat in my living room, trying to calm down. I told myself I had imagined it, that there was a logical explanation for everything. But I knew better. I never went back to that cabin. I never even looked at the listing again. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still feel it. That same heavy silence, that same feeling of eyes watching me from the dark. and I wonder, just for a moment, if whoever was out there that night ever left. I had never been the type to scare easily. I grew up hunting, hiking, and spending nights in the woods. So, when my old friend Eric asked if I wanted to join him for a weekend at his family's remote cabin deep in the mountains, I didn't hesitate. The drive up was uneventful. The roads were winding, the air crisp, and the further we got from town, the more I felt that familiar solitude I had always loved. Eric had warned me there wouldn't be any cell service, but I didn't mind. A weekend away from everything sounded perfect. The cabin was old but sturdy. It had been in Eric's family for generations, built by his grandfather back in the 50s. There was a small generator for power, but no plumbing, just an old outhouse about 50 feet into the woods. I didn't mind. I had camped in worse conditions. The first night was quiet. We made a fire outside, cooked some steaks, and drank a couple of beers. The air was cold, but the fire was warm, and the sound of the woods at night was something I had always found comforting. There was nothing unusual, nothing to put me on edge. It was the second night that everything changed. We had spent the day hiking, scouting the area, and even doing some light hunting. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, we made our way back to the cabin. I was exhausted. After dinner, Eric went inside to clean up, and I stayed outside, enjoying the last bit of warmth from the dying fire. That's when I heard it, a low, distant sound, almost like a hum or a growl. It wasn't an animal. I knew what animals sounded like. This was different. It was deep, almost mechanical, and seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I sat still, listening. The fire crackled. The wind rustled the trees, but that sound lingered just beneath it all. I turned toward the woods, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Then it stopped. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and shook my head. Maybe I was just tired. I put out the fire and went inside. That night, I woke up suddenly. The room was completely dark. The generator had been turned off for the night, and without it, the cabin was pitch black. Something had woken me up, but I wasn't sure what. Then I heard it again, that same deep, mechanical hum, closer this time, right outside the cabin. I stayed still, straining my ears. My heart pounded in my chest. The sound didn't move. It just lingered, vibrating through the walls. I wanted to wake Eric, but something told me not to move. Instead, I lay there listening, waiting. Minutes passed. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Eric about it. He shrugged it off. "Probably the wind," he said. But I knew it wasn't. Wind doesn't hum like that. It doesn't make your bones vibrate. I pushed it to the back of my mind and tried to focus on the day. We decided to check the perimeter of the cabin, looking for anything unusual. First, there was nothing. Just the usual signs of wildlife: tracks, fallen branches, the remnants of an old deer carcass. But then, about 50 yards from the cabin, we found something that made my stomach drop. The ground was torn up, like something heavy had been dragged through the dirt. The trees around the area were scarred, deep gashes in the bark like something with massive claws had raked through them. But the worst part was the footprints. They weren't human. They weren't animal. They were deep, wide, and long, almost like a boot print, but too irregular, too distorted. Eric went pale. What the hell made that? I didn't have an answer. We followed the tracks for a while, but they eventually disappeared into the thicker part of the forest. Whatever had made them was gone, or at least it wasn't in sight. We went back to the cabin, locked the doors, and sat in silence for a while. I could tell Eric was trying to rationalize it, but I could see the fear in his eyes. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound outside made my skin crawl. And then, just past midnight, it came back. The hum, louder this time, closer. The walls vibrated with the sound. I sat up, gripping the flashlight I had placed next to my bed. Eric was already awake, his eyes wide in the darkness. He heard it too. Then something moved outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy, Whatever it was right outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. Then the doorknob rattled. Eric and I both froze. The latch held, but the knob twisted violently, like someone or something was trying to get in. And then silence. No footsteps, no sound, just an awful, suffocating stillness. We didn't move for what felt like hours. Finally, when the first light of dawn crept through the windows, we grabbed our rifles, threw our gear together, and left. Neither of us spoke on the drive back. We didn't have to. I don't know what was out there. I don't know what made those tracks or that sound or tried to get inside the cabin. But I do know one thing. I will never go back. I drove up the winding road, tires crunching over loose gravel. The trees on either side of the narrow path stood tall and motionless, dark silhouettes against the fading light. I hadn't seen another car for miles. That was the whole point, though, to get away. No cell service, no work emails, no noise. Just me, a rented cabin, and a weekend of quiet. The cabin sat in a small clearing at the end of the road, an old wooden structure with a slanted roof and a covered porch. It looked like it had been there for decades, the wood aged and weather-worn. The rental ad had called it rustic serenity, but it looked more like old and forgotten. Still, I'd driven hours to be here, so I wasn't going to turn around now. I parked the car and grabbed my bag, stepping onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked under my weight. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The air inside smelled of dust and old wood. The layout was simple, one main room with a small kitchen along the back wall, a couch and a fireplace in the center, and a narrow hallway leading to a single bedroom and bathroom. The furniture was outdated but functional. The windows were small, with thick curtains that blocked out what little light remained. I set my bag down by the couch and stretched my arms. The place was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I turned on a few lights, checked my phone, no signal as expected, and decided to get settled. After putting my clothes in the small dresser in the bedroom, I walked into the kitchen. The fridge was old but running. I had brought enough food for the weekend, so I didn't need to rely on whatever was left here. I placed a bottle of water on the counter and turned around. A sharp creak from the hallway made me stop. My eyes flicked toward the doorway. The cabin had settled, I told myself. Old places creaked. I shook off the unease and walked into the main room, grabbing the book I'd brought along. An hour later, I had barely read a page. Every little sound made my ears perk up. The faint wind outside, the occasional groan of the wooden walls. I wasn't usually like this. I had spent time alone before, plenty of it. But something about this place made my skin crawl. I decided to turn in early. I shut off the lights, locked the doors, and checked the windows twice. Then I crawled into the small bed, pulling the thick blanket over me. The mattress was stiff, the pillows lumpy, but I was too tired to care. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I lay still, my heart pounding for no reason. The cabin was silent. Then I heard it, a soft, slow scrape. It was coming from outside, near the porch. I held my breath, listening. Another scrape, like something dragging against the wooden boards. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, but the sound didn't fit. It was too deliberate, too slow. I slid out of bed carefully, making my way toward the window. I pulled the curtain back a fraction of an inch, just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty. I waited, watching. My breath fogged up the glass. Nothing moved. Then, just as I was about to step away, I saw it. The porch railing. The dust on it had been disturbed, like something had gripped it and dragged its hand along the wood. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, the unease hadn't faded. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I had imagined it. I stepped outside onto the porch, squinting against the morning light. The railing looked normal, but the dust on the porch floor, the same dust that had covered everything inside the cabin, was disturbed. Faint smudges where something had been. I forced myself to shake it off. Maybe it had been the wind. Maybe an animal had gotten up here. I refused to let my mind go down the road it was trying to. The day passed quietly. I went for a walk in the woods, trying to enjoy the solitude. I sat on the porch in the afternoon, drinking coffee and reading. But every so often, I'd catch myself looking at the edge of the trees, scanning for something I couldn't name. That night, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I kept a flashlight and a small knife on the nightstand. I was being ridiculous, but I didn't care. I woke up to the sound of the doorknob turning. My stomach clenched so hard it hurt. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The knob rattled again, slow and testing. Someone was outside. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the bedroom door, ready to jump up if I had to. The rattling stopped. The cabin fell silent. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. My ears strained for any noise. Then, from outside, footsteps. Slow, measured. Moving away from the door, toward the trees. I didn't sleep. I stayed in that bed, gripping the flashlight so hard my fingers ached. When the first light of morning came, I packed my bag and left. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't stop to check the porch or the trees. As I drove away, I felt it, that deep, instinctive relief that only comes when you've escaped something you weren't meant to understand. I never found out who or what had been out there that night, and I never went back to find out. I drove deep into the woods, past where the dirt road turned to gravel, then to nothing but tire tracks winding through the trees. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a place to be alone for a few days and clear my head. The cabin belonged to an old friend of my father's, a man I had only met once or twice as a kid. He had moved out to the middle of nowhere after retiring, built the cabin himself, and eventually offered it up to friends who needed an escape. I wasn't sure why I had taken him up on it, but I didn't have anything better to do. The trees thickened as I got closer, their shadows stretching long across the dirt road. The last few miles had no cell service, no signs of other people, nothing but the sound of my tires crunching against gravel. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had dipped below the treetops, and the air had that dense, pressing stillness that only the deep woods have. The cabin itself was simple, a single story with a front porch, a small shed off to the side, and a lake just visible through the trees out back. I parked, grabbed my bag, and climbed the short steps to the door. The key was right where I had been told it would be, under an old horseshoe nailed to the porch railing. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled like wood and dust, a little damp from the recent rain. There was no electricity, just a few oil lamps and a wood stove in the corner. I dropped my bag on the small kitchen table, checked the single bedroom, then the bathroom. Everything was exactly as expected. I spent the first hour settling in, lighting a few lamps, checking the old propane stove, and making sure the firewood outside was dry enough to burn. The silence pressed in on me, thick and heavy. There were no sounds of cars, no distant hum of power lines, nothing but the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the rustling of leaves outside. That first night, I sat on the porch for a while, staring out into the woods. The sky was clear, the stars bright enough to cast a faint glow over the trees. The air was cool, damp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. I should have felt calm. Instead, I felt watched. Not in the way that makes the hair on your neck stand up, not yet, but in a way that made me hyper-aware of my own breathing, my own heartbeat. I shook it off and went inside, locking the door behind me. Hashtag. The second day was quiet. I spent the morning walking down to the lake, the water still and black, untouched. There was an old rowboat half sunk into the mud near the shore, the oars propped up inside. I thought about taking it out, but decided against it. Instead, I sat on the edge of the dock, listening to the woods. It wasn't until I got back to the cabin that I noticed something was off. My bag had moved, just a little, just enough for me to notice. The zipper was still closed, nothing missing, but I was sure I had left it at a different angle on the table. I told myself I was imagining things. By the afternoon, the feeling of being watched had returned. It wasn't the kind of paranoia that comes from isolation. I had spent plenty of time alone before. This was different. This was something else. The woods were too quiet. The usual sounds, birds, Insects, the distant rustling of small animals were gone. That night, I locked the door again and checked the window latch twice. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was silent. The darkness pressed in, the oil lamp on the table flickering slightly. Then I heard it, a soft scrape, like something moving against the outside wall. I held my breath, waiting. The sound came again, just under the window. Slow, deliberate. I forced myself to move, to sit up, to grab the hunting knife I had left by the bed. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I stayed still, listening. The sound stopped, then nothing. I didn't sleep much after that. Hashtag. The third day, I found the footprints. They weren't mine. They were barefoot, deep in the mud near the back of the cabin. Bigger than mine, too big to be from any animal out here. Just a few, leading from the treeline to the wall beneath my window, then back again. I tried to make sense of it. A hiker? A hunter? Someone messing with me? But why barefoot? I thought about leaving. I should have left. Instead, I went back inside, locked the door, and waited for nightfall. Hashtag. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair near the door, knife in hand, every lamp burning low. The air inside felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. Hours passed. Then, just past 3 in the morning, the scratching returned. This time, it was at the door. Slow, testing. Then the handle moved. I gripped the knife so hard my hand ached. The latch held. The movement stopped. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I counted the steps. 1 lap around, then another, then silence. I stayed awake until dawn. Hashtag. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't eat, didn't stop to think, just grabbed my bag and threw it into the truck. The footprints were back, more of them this time, circling the cabin, stopping just at the porch steps. I didn't look back as I started the engine, didn't stop to check my phone until I was miles away, back where the road turned to pavement and the signal returned. No messages, no calls, nothing to explain what had happened. A week later, I got a text from my father's friend. Hope you had a good stay. Let me know if you ever want to go back. I never answered. I never went back. I never liked being alone in the woods. Even when I was a kid, there was something about the silence that felt too heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I hated how my ears would ring after a while, how every little sound felt bigger, closer. So when my brother asked if I wanted to use his cabin for the weekend, I almost said no. Almost. But I needed the break. Work had been killing me, and I hadn't had a real night's sleep in weeks. He swore it was peaceful up there. No neighbors, no noise, just the trees and the lake. I got there late Friday afternoon. The drive took longer than I thought it would, winding roads getting narrower the further I went. The last few miles were just dirt, lined with thick pines that blocked out most of the sky. By the time I pulled up, the sun was low, throwing long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was small, built of dark wood, with a single porch light that flickered when I turned it on. The key was under the rock like my brother said it would be. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood, but everything looked clean enough. A single room, mostly, with a little kitchen in the corner and a bed against the back wall. No TV, no radio, just a stack of old books and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I dropped my bag on the floor, set up the sleeping bag on the bed just to be safe. God knows what kind of spiders were in the sheets, and went out to bring in some firewood. That's when I noticed it. Footprints. They weren't mine. I had just gotten there. And they weren't my brother's either. He hadn't been up in weeks. But there they were, clear as day in the dirt leading from the trees to the cabin door. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet. I stood there for a long time just looking at them. My first thought was animals, but no animal I knew left prints that perfect. My second thought was maybe someone had come by. A hiker, maybe, or some kid screwing around. But that didn't sit right either. The closest town was miles away, and there weren't any trails nearby. I shook it off. Maybe they were old. Maybe the last rain had just washed them clean. I had been on edge all week. I wasn't going to let a few footprints ruin my weekend. Inside, I locked the door, lit the fire, ate one of the sandwiches I brought, tried to read, but my mind wouldn't settle. Every now and then, I thought I heard something outside, a rustling in the leaves, the snap of a branch. Normal wood sounds, probably. I told myself that over and over. It was just after midnight when I finally crawled into my sleeping bag. I left the fire burning low, more for the light than the warmth. The cabin creaked in the wind. I closed my eyes. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were soft, barely there, but I knew what I was hearing. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the porch. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I listened. The steps stopped right outside the door. Whoever it was, they weren't knocking. They weren't trying to get in. They were just standing there. Minutes passed. I wanted to sit up, to look, but I was too scared. My back was to the door, and I wasn't sure I wanted to see who was out there. And then, just as slowly, the steps moved away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I forced myself to check outside. The footprints were back. More of them, a dozen at least, circling the cabin. All bare feet. I packed my things and left. Didn't even eat breakfast. Didn't even lock the door behind me. Just got in my car and drove, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. When I got home, I called my brother, told him someone had been up there, that he should check it out. He laughed, said I was imagining things. Maybe he's right. Maybe it was just my nerves. Maybe I was too tired, too stressed, seeing things that weren't there. But I know what I heard, and I know this. I'm never going back to that cabin. It was a last-minute decision. My buddy Mike was supposed to come with me, but his wife got sick, and he backed out the night before. I had the time off work, the place was already paid for, and I figured a weekend away from everything would be good for me. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. So, I packed up my truck and drove out Friday afternoon. The cabin was deep in the woods, about 2 hours from the nearest town. I rented it from some guy on a website, and the pictures made it look cozy. Wood-paneled walls, a big stone fireplace, and a porch overlooking a lake. When I arrived, it was already late afternoon, and the place looked just like the pictures, except for one thing. It felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The air was heavy, the silence almost too thick. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet you'd expect in the woods. It was the kind that made your ears ring like something was missing. I chalked it up to me being alone and unloaded my stuff. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no TV, just a radio and a landline phone for emergencies. That was fine with me. I wanted to unplug anyway. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some food, and read a book by lantern light. Around midnight, I turned in. The bed was old and creaked every time I moved, but I was tired from the drive and fell asleep fast. Then something woke me up. It was a sound, faint but distinct, something moving outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But as I lay there, holding my breath, I realized it sounded deliberate, like footsteps, slow and measured, circling the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. My truck was parked outside, so if it was another person, they knew someone was here. I reached for the flashlight I'd left on the nightstand and clicked it on, aiming it at the window. The glass reflected the light back at me, showing only my own pale, tense face. For a long time, I just sat there, listening. The footsteps had stopped. The woods were silent again. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the sounds of nature can play tricks on you when you're alone. Eventually, I lay back down, keeping the flashlight in my hand, and somehow, I drifted off. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around the cabin. The ground was damp from the night air, and I spotted them immediately. Footprints. Human footprints. They circled the cabin once, then led off into the trees. My stomach dropped. I told myself it could have been a hiker. Maybe someone was lost and wandered close. But the thing that unsettled me the most was how fresh the prints looked. Someone had been out there last night, just beyond the walls where I slept. I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. I went down to the lake, fished for a bit, and forced myself to enjoy the fresh air. The sun was warm, the water calm. By the time evening rolled around, I convinced myself I was overreacting. That night, I locked every door and window before going to bed. I kept my flashlight and a hunting knife next to me. I told myself I wouldn't let my imagination get the best of me. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound of footsteps was clear, closer than before. They weren't circling now. They were stopping, starting, pausing near the windows. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold. The soft, metallic click of the doorknob being tested. I sat up, gripping my knife so tight my knuckles ached. The door was locked. I made sure of it. But that didn't stop whoever was out there from trying. The knob rattled once more, then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My heart pounded in my ears. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps retreated, fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn crept through the window. As soon as it was bright enough to see, I grabbed my stuff, threw it into my truck, and got the hell out of there. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. Something in the trees caught my eye. A figure, half hidden in the shadows, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't call out. I just drove. When I got home, I went straight to my laptop and pulled up the rental listing. It was gone. No record of the cabin, no listing, nothing. Like it had never existed. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back. I drove up the winding road, watching as the trees thickened on both sides. The sun was already dipping below the hills, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. I could see the cabin up ahead, a dark shape against the sky. It wasn't the first time I'd stayed somewhere isolated, but something about this trip felt different. I had rented the place for a week. The listing online described it as a rustic getaway with modern amenities. The photos made it look warm and inviting, but now, seeing it in person, I felt uneasy. The logs were dark, aged with time, and the windows looked like black holes staring back at me. I told myself I was just tired from the drive. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into the driveway. The trees pressed in close, making it feel like the forest was swallowing the place whole. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing, just silence. I grabbed my bag and stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air smelled like pine and something else, something faint, metallic. I ignored it and made my way to the front door. The key was under a rock beside the steps, just as the owner had said in his email. Inside, the cabin was small but comfortable. A stone fireplace stood against the far wall, a worn-out couch in front of it. The kitchen was basic but had everything I needed. There was only one bedroom, with a heavy wooden bed frame and a quilt that looked handmade. Everything was neat, but there was a smell. Not strong, but enough to make me notice. Like something old and damp, like wet wood mixed with something sour. I pushed the thought aside, set my bag down, and locked the door behind me. The owner had mentioned there was no Wi-Fi and barely any cell service, which I had been fine with when I booked it. Now, standing here alone, it didn't seem like such a great idea. I spent the first night reading by the fire, listening to the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I told myself that's all it was, just the place adjusting to the cold night air. Around midnight, I turned in, exhausted from the long drive. The bed was stiff, but the thick quilt was warm. I fell asleep fast. I woke up sometime later, unsure of what had pulled me from sleep. The room was pitch black. I reached for my phone, but the screen was dead. I had charged it before bed. Maybe the power had flickered? I sat up, listening. There was a sound, faint, a slow, dragging noise coming from outside. I stayed completely still, straining to hear. It was probably just an animal, a raccoon or something. Still, I felt my heartbeat pick up. The sound stopped, then a soft thud. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It sounded like something heavy dropping onto the porch. I slid out of bed, moving carefully. The floor was cold under my feet. I crept toward the front door, heart hammering. The porch light wasn't on, and without my phone, I had no way to see outside. I waited, breath held. Nothing, just silence again. After a few minutes, I forced myself to go back to bed. My mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe a tree branch had fallen, or something had been knocked over by the wind. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The porch was empty. The trees stood still, undisturbed. But the smell was worse, stronger, like something had been left to rot. I walked around the cabin, checking the edges of the forest. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They were fresh, leading from the tree-line to the porch. Bare feet, the toes dug slightly into the mud, the prints uneven. I followed them with my eyes, my stomach twisting. They stopped at the porch steps, but there were no footprints leading away. I swallowed hard, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The morning was completely still. I stepped back inside and locked the door. I told myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe the prints had faded overnight, washed away by dew. But my gut told me otherwise. That night, I kept a fire going. I didn't like how dark the cabin felt when the flames died out. I tried to read again, but couldn't focus. I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see something staring back at me. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again. The dragging sound, closer this time. I sat up, heart pounding. My phone was still dead. I had checked earlier, but it refused to charge. Then the thud. I gripped the quilt, listening. The cabin was old, the walls thin. I could hear something breathing outside. Slow, heavy breaths. My own breathing became shallow. I didn't move. The sound of footsteps on the porch. Not hurried, slow, deliberate. I wanted to run. But where? Into the woods? That was worse. Then the doorknob rattled. I held my breath. The rattling stopped. Silence stretched on forever. Then the breathing started again, just on the other side of the door. I didn't sleep. I sat there, heart hammering, until the first light of morning crept through the windows. When I finally got the courage to open the door, there were no footprints this time. No signs of anything, but the smell was worse, almost unbearable. That was enough for me. I packed my bag, threw it in the car, and left. I didn't care about the refund. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat there, quiet and still. But something was wrong. The door. I knew I had locked it, but now it was open.